year 1274 BCE. The desert trembles under thousands of thundering hooves. Egyptian chariots, painted in red and gold, and bearing the falcon of Pharaoh Ramses II, race across the plain. Archers steady their bows. Dust turns the horizon into a burning haze. Across the field, the Hittite army holds the line, chariots packed 3 men deep, shields locked, bronze helmets glittering in the Syrian sun. Trumpets blare, war cries echo, and at a place called Kadesh 2 superpowers collide. Spears shatter, arrows fall in black swarms, men disappear into the chaos. Lines break and reform as Ramses, legend says, charges into the melee, his chariot wheels cutting through dust and bodies alike. For a few brutal hours, the fate of empires hangs in the balance. But this is only one heartbeat in a story that stretches across 3,000 years. Most empires burn bright and die fast. Assyria terrorizes the Near East for a couple of centuries, then crumbles. Alexander's Macedonian Empire dissolves almost as soon as he's gone. Even the 1,000-year Reich collapses in little more than a decade. Egypt is different, from the first king who binds the Nile into one realm, to Cleopatra's last stand against Rome. Egypt endures. Dynasties rise and fall, temples are built and buried, gods change their names and faces, but the civilization remains. How did one culture keep its power and identity for millennia? What turned its rulers into beings who were not just kings but living gods? And after surviving invasions, plagues, and civil wars, how did this eternal land finally break? To find out, we have to step far away from Kadesh, back to the river that made everything possible. Our story begins before there were pharaohs, when the Nile was simply a lifeline cutting through the desert. First comes the pre-dynastic world, small farming villages along the river, learning to read the rhythm of the flood. Rival chiefs trade, raid, and slowly stitch together larger realms. Around 3100 BC, a ruler we call Narmer unites Upper and Lower Egypt under one crown. Egypt is born. Then, the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramid builders. Kings like Djoser and Khufu command vast resources to raise stone mountains at Saqqara and Giza, monuments so precise and immense they still defy belief. Yet even this system is fragile. Climate stress, famine, and political fragmentation strike. Power splinters, and Egypt falls into the first intermediate period. From that chaos emerges the Middle Kingdom, a rebirth of centralized rule. Pharaohs reunify the land, reform administration, and push Egypt's borders into Nubia. But renewed strength draws new threats. From the northeast come the Hyksos, foreign rulers who seize the delta and introduce the horse and chariot. Driven out, the Egyptians adapt. Armed with these new tools, they forge the new kingdom, Egypt's golden age. Now we meet Hatshepsut, the queen who rules as king. Akhenaten, who dares to overturn the old religion. Tutankhamun, whose brief reign leaves a long shadow. And Ramses II, builder of temples and veteran of Kadesh. Egypt becomes an empire, projecting power deep into Syria and Nubia. After the high point comes a long decline. Libyan chieftains, Assyrian armies, and Persian kings rule the Nile. Alexander the Great arrives. Greek pharaohs, the Ptolemies, take the throne. At last, Cleopatra VII faces the rising power of Rome. Her final defeat in 30 BC ends 3,000 years of pharaonic rule. Along this path, we'll follow not just kings and battles, but farmers, priests, workers, and scribes, how they lived, worked, and believed. Egypt is more than pyramids and mummies. It is one of humanity's first great experiments in complex civilization. Here we see the blueprint for a powerful, centralized monarchy. A single ruler at the top, supported by layers of scribes, officials, and governors who make the state function from the Mediterranean coast to the southern cataracts. We see a bureaucracy that can count grain, mobilize tens of thousands of workers, and coordinate vast building projects, centuries before many cultures even develop writing. Here, religion and state are welded together. The pharaoh is not only head of government, but high priest of every temple, the living embodiment of divine order. Taxes, justice, and even the rising sun are understood through the language of gods and rituals. To obey the king is to uphold the universe itself, but the Egypt we think we know is often a mirage. Endless lines of slaves whipped up ramps to build pyramids? The truth is more complex. Organized teams of laborers, housed, fed, and managed with remarkable efficiency, skilled workers who took pride in what they built. Cleopatra as nothing but a dangerous seductress. In reality, a multilingual, highly educated ruler, navigating an impossible diplomatic game between rival Roman strongmen. Akhenaten as a mad heretic who randomly destroyed Egypt's religion. His revolution was not simple insanity, but a calculated attempt to reshape religious power and challenge entrenched priesthoods. This documentary will peel back those myths and cliches, revealing a civilization stranger, more sophisticated and more human than the Hollywood version. And to understand how such a system could arise and endure, we must start before there were crowns or pyramids at all. We return to the Nile, to scattered villages along its banks, to a land that is not yet Egypt, but soon will become eternal. Before kings, before pyramids, there was the river. Each year, as the star Sirius reappeared in the dawn sky, the people along the Nile knew what was coming. Far to the south, in lands they would never see, rains fell in the highlands of Africa. Weeks later, the river in Egypt began to rise, slowly at first, then steadily, until it spilled over its banks and spread out across the floodplain. For months, fields disappeared under a broad brown sheet of water. Then, just as predictably, the flood receded. In its wake, it left a skin of dark, fertile silt, a rich black soil that transformed the valley into a narrow strip of green in the middle of endless sand. This rhythm, the flood, the retreat, the planting, was the heartbeat of early Egypt. Because the Nile was so regular, people could plan their lives around it. Unlike the violent, unpredictable rivers of Mesopotamia, the Nile was surprisingly gentle and consistent. Farmers learned when to sow and when to harvest. They knew how much grain to expect. Over time, they produced more than they needed just to survive. That surplus changed everything. Extra grain meant more mouths could be fed. Populations grew. Not everyone had to farm. Some people could devote themselves to crafting tools or pottery, weaving cloth, or organizing storage. Others could specialize as priests, watching the heavens and predicting the flood. Leaders emerged to coordinate irrigation, settle disputes, and protect the harvest. Geography shaped their worldview. The Egyptians spoke of two lands, the Black Land and the Red Land. The Black Land was the fertile strip along the river, moist, dark, and full of life. Beyond it stretched the Red Land, the harsh desert, dry, blazing, and deadly. Stand on the floodplain and you could literally see the border between life and death. The Nile itself became a divine gift, a visible sign that the universe could be trusted. Order, what the Egyptians would later call Mot, was embodied in the river's steady rise and fall. Chaos, or Isfet, lurked in the burning deserts beyond, in failed floods, in droughts and sandstorms. Early religious thought grew out of this contrast. The river wasn't just water. It was the blood of the gods. Deities were imagined to control the flood, to oversee the balance between plenty and famine. Keeping them satisfied, honoring them with rituals and offerings, became a matter of survival. And because the Nile is one long, continuous corridor running from south to north, it encouraged a particular political dream. If someone could control this river from end to end, they could control all the land it watered. One river, one route, one potential axis of power. The stage was set for villages to grow, compete, and eventually for one ruler to try to bind them all together. Along the banks of this predictable river, the first permanent communities began to appear. By the Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods, simple camps had evolved into real villages. Imagine narrow lanes of mud brick houses, their walls sun-baked hard, their roofs flat and useful. People cooked, slept, and worked on those rooftops, catching the breeze above the dust. Inside, rooms were small and practical. A place to sleep, a place to store grain, a hearth for cooking. Granaries, round or rectangular silos made from mud brick, stood at the center of many settlements. These were more than just storage bins. They were life insurance. A good flood meant full granaries, and full granaries meant safety through lean years. Whoever controlled the keys to those granaries held real power. The tools of everyday life were still simple but increasingly specialized. Stone grinders turned grain into flour, clay pots stored beer, water, and oil. With the introduction of copper, people could use sharper knives, awls, and small axes. Each innovation made work more efficient, and each step forward in technology widened the gap between those who had access to resources and those who didn't. We see that gap clearly in how people were buried. Early cemeteries along the Nile show simple graves, shallow pits, bodies curled on their sides, perhaps a pot of food or a small tool. But nearby, we start to find richer burials, larger pits lined with mats, better pottery, fine stone pallets, beads of exotic stones, and eventually copper weapons or ornaments. Not everyone could be buried like this. These are the graves of local elites, men and women who had more wealth, more connections, and likely more authority. In life, they controlled labor, decided where fields would be dug, managed trade expeditions, and led in times of conflict. In death, their status was displayed for all to see. Trade helped these leaders rise. The Nile acted as a natural highway. Boats could move upstream with sails and downstream with the current. Village chiefs sent expeditions south toward Nubia, east into the desert for stone and copper, and north toward the delta and the Mediterranean. Exotic goods, turquoise, obsidian, rare stones, fine ceramics, flowed into the hands of those who could afford to sponsor expeditions. With wealth came symbols, on pottery, carved on stone pallets and placed in graves. We begin to see images that will later become central to pharaonic power. Fierce animals like lions and bulls, falcons perched on standards, rows of bound captives, boats flying emblems. These weren't yet full royal icons, but they were hints, early visual language linking strength, leadership, and the divine. Village by village, cemetery by cemetery, a pattern was emerging. A society stratified by wealth and status, tied together by trade, organized by local chiefs, and already using symbols and ceremony to justify who stood at the top. The question was no longer whether there would be leaders, but how powerful and how far their rule could reach. As centuries passed, these scattered communities began to coalesce into larger regions, each with its own character and ambitions. To the south was Upper Egypt. Here, the Nile cuts through a narrow valley, hemmed in by cliffs and desert. The strip of fertile land is thin, sometimes only a few hundred meters wide. Villages line the river like beads on a string, each one close to the next, all dependent on the same life-giving water. This geography encouraged unity and toughness. Travel was mostly linear, upstream or downstream. Strategic points along the river could be watched and controlled. Communities in Upper Egypt became accustomed to long-distance river journeys, to defending their narrow corridor, to thinking of the Nile as a single route that could be dominated. To the north lay Lower Egypt, the delta. Here, the river fans out into a maze of channels before meeting the Mediterranean. The land is lush and broad, with multiple branches of the Nile creating patches of fertile ground separated by waterways and marshes. It's a landscape of abundance, but also of fragmentation. In the delta, power was more diffuse. Instead of one tight ribbon of settlements, there were many local centers, each controlling its own patch of rich soil and its own access to trade routes along the coast. Dozens of small polities, proto-kingdoms, emerged, forming and dissolving alliances, competing for land, water, and influence. Upper Egypt, more constrained and linear, tended toward stronger, more centralized leaders who could coordinate the whole valley. Lower Egypt, more open and branching, tended toward a patchwork of competing chiefs. Both regions were wealthy in different ways. Upper Egypt controlled key points along the river and access to southern trade. Lower Egypt enjoyed the enormous agricultural and commercial potential of the delta. The tension between these two lands became a driving force in Egypt's pre-dynastic history. Archaeological evidence suggests that in Upper Egypt, some centers began to dominate their neighbors. Places like Hierakonpolis and Nakada grew into regional powers, absorbing smaller communities. Their elites built larger tombs, commanded stronger armies, and developed more sophisticated symbols of authority. These ambitious rulers looked north and saw opportunity. The delta's wealth, its access to the sea, its many rival chiefs too divided to stand together for long. Skirmishes, raids, and shifting alliances became part of life along the river. Riverboats carried not just traders, but warriors. Standards bearing animal emblems flew above warbands. Local victories were commemorated with carvings showing defeated enemies, trampled bodies, and bound captives, imagery that would later appear on royal monuments. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt were more than just regions on a map. They were two different political worlds, locked in a slow struggle over who would shape the future of the Nile Valley. Eventually, that struggle would reach a breaking point. One warlord from the south would claim both lands, take their symbols as his own, and declare that the two lands had become one. In a glass case in Cairo, not far from the noise of modern traffic, lies a slab of dark green stone, no bigger than a laptop. It's worn, chipped at the edges, and never meant to be a casual work of art. It was a ritual object, used for grinding cosmetics, yet carved into its surface is one of the most important turning points in human political history. This is the Narmer palette, and it captures the moment Egypt becomes one. Start at the top of one side. Two faces stare out. A woman with cow's ears and horns, repeated on either corner. This is likely Hathor, or a related early cow goddess, protector of kings, motherly yet powerful. Between her two faces is a small rectangle, a frame called a serik. Inside it, a catfish and a chisel, the sounds Nar and Mer. Together, they spell the name of a king, Narmer. Below, the scene explodes into motion. A towering figure dominates the composition. He wears the tall, white crown of Upper Egypt, long, conical, rising above his head like a spear. In his right hand, he raises a heavy ceremonial mace, frozen just before it comes crashing down. With his left, he grips the hair of a kneeling enemy, pulling the man's head back, exposing his skull. The captive is naked, vulnerable, one arm lifted in a useless gesture of appeal or fear. Bare feet emphasize his humiliation. He is outside the ordered world, stripped of status and protection. Behind the king stands a small, calm figure, the sandal bearer, carrying Narmer's sandals and a jar. His presence is crucial. The king stands barefoot because he acts on sacred ground, performing a ritualized act of violence in the name of the gods. To the right of the king's head, a falcon perches on a cluster of papyrus plants. The falcon is Horus, the god who embodies the living king. From his claw extends a cord that pierces a human head emerging from the reeds. This is no random victim. The papyrus represents Lower Egypt, the Delta. The tethered head symbolizes the land itself brought under Horus's control. In one compact image, the message is unmistakable. The ruler of Upper Egypt, backed by Horus, is subduing Lower Egypt. This isn't just about killing an enemy. It's the universe being set in order, Mot imposed on chaos. Turn the palette over. Again, at the top, the goddess's faces and Narmer's name. But the scene beneath has changed. Now the king wears a completely different headdress, the red crown of Lower Egypt. It's low and scooped, with a tall protruding coil at the front. This is the symbol of the Delta, the marshlands in the north. Narmer strides forward in a formal procession. Before him walk standard bears holding poles topped with animal emblems, falcons, bulls, each likely representing powerful gods or important domains under his control. Ahead of them, 4 decapitated bodies lie neatly arranged, their heads placed between their legs, above the corpses. Small hieroglyphs probably name conquered towns or peoples. Again, order out of chaos. The king walks as a calm, controlled force. His enemies are reduced to mute symbols. At the bottom of this side, 2 fantastical beasts twist their long, serpent-like necks around a central circle. Their handlers struggle to restrain them with ropes. These are serpopards, mythical leopard serpents. Their intertwined necks form a rounded depression, the original cosmetic grinding surface. Symbolically, this knot of writhing creatures around a unified circle may represent the tying together of 2 regions into one, their wild energies harnessed by royal power. Finally, on the bottom of the first side, a bull, often associated with royal strength, charges at a fortified enclosure. The wall crumbles beneath his horns. An enemy lies trampled underfoot. Cities that resist the new order will meet the same fate. Across both faces, a single story unfolds. A king of Upper Egypt, favored by the gods, defeats and subdues Lower Egypt and proclaims himself lord of both. When later Egyptian rulers call themselves king of Upper and Lower Egypt, this is the visual origin of that claim. And out of this imagery emerges one of history's most enduring symbols, the double crown. Later depictions show the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt worn together, stacked into one composite headdress called the skent, white plus red, south plus north, valley plus delta, 2 lands, 1 king. The double crown is more than costume. It's a political manifesto in color and shape. The ruler doesn't simply conquer lands. He fuses them. He is not just a warlord, but the living axis holding the Nile world together. But how literal is this story? Archaeologists have found the names of earlier rulers carved on pottery and tombs. Eri-Hor-Ka and the so-called Scorpion King, known from a ceremonial Maasai head where he wears the white crown and oversees the opening of irrigation canals. Some scholars argue that Narmer wasn't the first to dream of unification, but the one who finished a long process. For generations, kings from Upper Egypt had been expanding northward, fighting rival chiefs, marrying into local elites, and slowly absorbing territories. The unification may have been gradual, a series of wars, alliances, and administrative mergers. In this view, the Narmer palette is as much propaganda as it is record. It compresses decades of conflict and negotiation into a single, divinely sanctioned act. One king, one blow, one newly unified country. Regardless of where we place every battle on a timeline, the political result is clear. By Narmer's era, Egypt is transformed from scattered chiefdoms into something entirely new, a territorial state. For the first time in history, a single ruler governs a continuous stretch of land hundreds of kilometers long, with planned administrative centers, organized taxation, and a sense of shared identity along the entire river. To hold this together, force was essential. A standing military, no longer just temporary warbands, was needed to secure borders, patrol trade routes, and suppress local rebellions. Fortified sites at choke points along the Nile and desert tracks became bases for soldiers and officials. Control of trade became a weapon of power. Goods from Nubia, incense from the Red Sea, copper from Sinai, and prestige objects from the Levant now moved under royal oversight. Whoever controlled the flow of these resources controlled loyalty. Above all, Narmer and his successors put in place the ideological foundation that would define Egypt for 3,000 years. The idea that the king is not merely a human ruler, but the earthly form of Horus, responsible for defending Mot against chaos in both the human and cosmic realms. On that small palette, carved for ritual and display, we glimpse the birth of a new kind of power, the pharaoh. Conquering a land is one thing. Governing it is another. Once Upper and Lower Egypt were united, whether by Narmer's hand alone or through a sequence of kings. The new regime needed a center, a single point from which the king could watch the two lands and make them function as one. That center was Memphis. According to later tradition, Narmer's successor Menes, possibly the same figure under another name, or a close descendant, founded Memphis where Upper and Lower Egypt meet. Geographically, it was a masterstroke. Stand in early Memphis and you're standing at a hinge. To the south, the Nile narrows into the long valley of Upper Egypt, a corridor of rock and green that leads toward Nubia. To the north, the river fans into the delta, branching into many channels that scatter toward the Mediterranean. Whoever controls this point controls movement between the valley and the delta. Grain moving south, soldiers moving north, traders sailing in from the Levant, all of them pass this gateway. From Memphis, the king could oversee shipments of grain taxes collected in the lush delta. Dispatch officials and troops upstream to monitor quarries, mines, and southern borders. Coordinate expeditions into the deserts to the east and west. But geography wasn't enough. A unified Egypt required a new kind of machinery, an administrative state. Local village chiefs and clan leaders still existed, but they now answered to a hierarchy of royal officials. The most crucial tool in their hands was something new and powerful: writing. The earliest hieroglyphs appear in this period on labels, jars, and ceremonial objects. At first, they're short, a name, a place, a quantity, but even this minimal writing revolutionized power. With marks on clay or stone, the center could count, record, and remember. Scribes, specialists trained to read and write, became essential cogs in the system. Armed with reed pens and palettes of black and red ink, they noted how much grain each district towed, how many workers were assigned to a project, what offerings were due to which temple. Taxation, at its core, was agricultural. Farmers paid the state in kind: grain, oil, linen. These goods flowed into state granaries, especially around Memphis. From there, officials redistributed supplies to feed workers on royal building projects, provision garrisons at strategic sites, support the king's court and temples. In this way, Memphis became not just a political capital, but an economic heart, where the pulse of surplus beat loudest. With administration came ideology. If Narmer's palette shows a warrior unifying the two lands, the early dynastic kings at Memphis refined a second, equally important role: the king as priest. In a world where the Nile's flood, the sun's rising, and the success of crops were all seen as fragile gifts from the gods, someone had to guarantee that the gods were satisfied. That someone was the king. He stood between the divine and human realms. In temple reliefs and rituals, he offers incense, pours libations, and presents miniature images of Mot, the goddess of truth, balance, and order. By doing this, he symbolically feeds the gods, who in turn keep the cosmos running correctly. If the king fulfilled his duties, Mot prevailed, the Nile flooded properly, seasons followed their course, enemies were held back, justice was done. If he failed, chaos, Isfet, would creep in. Drought, invasion, rebellion, disorder. Around Memphis, early temples and shrines began to formalize this relationship. Priests served under royal authority. Religious ceremonies reinforced political messages. Egypt is one, the king is chosen by the gods, the social order reflects divine will. Thus, the bureaucracy and the religion supported each other. Scribes recorded offerings to temples. Temples legitimized the state. The state in turn funded temples, all rested on the figure at the center. The pharaoh, now more than ever a sacred institution as well as a human being. From the outside, this new state machine might have looked unstoppable. A unified land, a central capital, a writing system, a tax apparatus, an army, and a king backed by heaven. And yet, the rulers of Memphis were just getting started. Holding Egypt together was one challenge, proving that a king could command not only the living, but also eternity itself was another. With a unified state and a divine king, Egypt attempts something the world has never seen, to raise mountains of stone for the dead. Before pyramids, there were rectangles. For generations, Egyptian elites were buried in low, flat tombs called mastabas. From above, they looked like giant mud-brick benches, hence the modern name, from the Arabic for stone bench. A mastaba had sloping sides, a flat roof, and underground chambers where the dead were laid to rest with food, pottery, and prized possessions. Solid, respectable, but hardly revolutionary. Then one king, Djoser of the Third Dynasty, and one man, Imhotep, changed everything. Imagine Saqqara, not yet filled with stone monuments. The desert edge rises above the green floodplain of Memphis. Here, Djoser decides to build his eternal house. At first, it is planned like any other royal mastaba, a large rectangular structure. But at some point in the project, the plan grows more ambitious. Instead of a single mastaba, the builders add another, smaller one on top, then another, and another. The result is something no one has seen before, a staircase of stone, rising in 6 great steps toward the sky. The Step Pyramid of Djoser, history's first monumental pyramid, is born. Crucially, this is not just a tomb. The Step Pyramid stands at the heart of a vast, walled complex, over 15 hectares in size. Inside its high limestone enclosure walls lies an entire stone city of the dead. Courtyards, shrines, dummy chapels, colonnaded halls. Many of these buildings are solid, without interior rooms. They exist purely as stage sets for the king's rituals in eternity. At the center of all this innovation is a name we actually know, Imhotep, inscribed on statues of Djoser. Imhotep is called Chief of Sculptors, Overseer of Works, and High Priest of Heliopolis. He is architect, engineer, priest, and royal official, one of the first individuals in history whose creative mind we can glimpse. Imhotep's genius lies in several bold decisions. He replaces traditional mudbrick with fine limestone, turning what was once temporary into something that could, in theory, last forever. He takes the mastaba form and reimagines it in 3 dimensions, stacking it into a symbolic stairway to heaven. He designs the complex as a controlled world. High walls, single narrow entrances, carefully choreographed pathways. Centuries later, Imhotep's reputation grows larger than life. By the New Kingdom, he is remembered as a sage and healer. In the late period, he is worshipped as a god of wisdom and medicine, his temples visited by petitioners seeking cures and answers. A royal architect becomes, over time, a divine genius. But in Djoser's own age, the Step Pyramid complex already sends a clear message. First, it proclaims that the king commands stone. Where earlier rulers built primarily in mud, brick, and wood, Djoser's tomb uses thousands upon thousands of precisely cut limestone blocks. Organizing the quarrying, transport, and fitting of this material required an unprecedented level of administrative coordination. Second, it shows that the king controls labor on a colossal scale. Farmers who once worked only their local fields can now be mobilized, seasonally, to build a structure visible for kilometers. Their work is not just construction, it is worship in stone. Third, the complex turns space itself into propaganda. High walls exclude ordinary people. Only select priests and officials can enter the inner sanctuaries. Inside, the king appears in statues and reliefs performing sacred rituals, even in death. The architecture teaches a lesson: access to the gods runs through the king, and the king alone. The step pyramid is therefore more than an architectural experiment. It is a new model of power, the pharaoh as the axis between earth and sky, whose eternal well-being justifies the mobilization of an entire nation. The age of Mastobus is not over, but on the plateau of Saqqara, a new idea stands in the sun. If a dead king can climb to the gods, perhaps his monument must reach as high as human hands can build. That idea will soon be taken to its ultimate, breathtaking extreme. A few generations after Djoser, on a plateau further north at Giza, the experiment reaches its peak. Here, in the 4th dynasty, Pharaoh Khufu orders a tomb so vast that it will define monumental for the rest of human history, the Great Pyramid. Stand at its base and look up. Originally, it rose about 146 meters high, its sides smooth and gleaming with polished Tura limestone casing blocks that reflected the sun like a giant, man-made mountain of light. Today, most of that casing is gone, but the core remains, a staggering 2.3 million stone blocks, some weighing more than 10 to 15 tons. How did they do it? There was no magic, no aliens, no lost super technology. What Egypt did have was something just as impressive: people, time, and organization. First, the stone. Much of the core limestone came from quarries just south of the plateau itself. Workers cut blocks from the bedrock using copper chisels, wooden wedges, and stone hammers. Harder stone, like granite for the king's chamber, was quarried far to the south at Aswan, then shipped down the Nile on boats during the flood season. Archaeological finds of ancient harbor installations near Giza show that boats could dock close to the plateau, unloading stone and supplies. From there, teams dragged blocks on wooden sledges over prepared tracks, wetting the sand in front of the sledges, as shown in a famous tomb scene from a later period, could reduce friction and make the task far more efficient. Then, the ramps. We haven't found a complete ramp system, but traces and logic give us clues. The most likely scenario is not a single, absurdly long straight ramp, but a combination of a broad, straight, or slightly inclined ramp used in the early stages to lift stone to a moderate height. Later, as the pyramid grew, zigzagging earthen ramps, or wrapping ramps along the sides, adjusted as the structure increased. These ramps were made of mud brick and rubble, cheap, reusable materials. Once a phase was complete, parts of the ramp could be dismantled and recycled elsewhere. Now, the people, for centuries, popular culture imagined the Great Pyramid built by endless lines of whip-driven slaves, dragged from foreign lands, collapsing under the sun while cruel overseers shouted. The evidence in the ground tells a very different story. Just south of the pyramids, archaeologists have uncovered workers' villages, rows of simple but organized houses, bakeries, breweries, storage facilities. Nearby cemeteries contain the graves of the men who built the pyramids, buried with care, sometimes with small offerings. Their bones show signs of hard physical labor, yes, but also of medical treatment, healed fractures, set bones. Food remains, including cattle, sheep, and goat bones, suggest that workers received substantial rations of meat, alongside bread and beer. This was no starving slave gang, it was a workforce worth investing in. Inscriptions and graffiti add more detail. On blocks inside the Great Pyramid and nearby, builders' marks record the names of work crews, with titles like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkaure. These teams had identities and pride in their work. They were likely rotating groups of conscripted farmers, serving for part of the year when the Nile flood made agriculture impossible. Mixed with permanent, skilled specialists, stonecutters, surveyors, foremen. Think less chained slaves, more massive national labor project, where service could be both obligation and honor, over 20 years or so, with a workforce perhaps in the tens of thousands, spread out across quarries, ramps, transport crews, house builders, cooks, brewers, and administrators. The Great Pyramid rose layer by layer. To make this happen, someone had to plan everything. Surveyors laid out the pyramid's orientation with astonishing precision, aligning it closely to the cardinal directions. Administrators tracked how much stone was quarried, how many men were on which crew, how much grain and beer they needed each day. Local officials in the provinces ensured that tax grain reached the royal stores. Ship captains coordinated deliveries with the flood. This is where the true marvel of the Great Pyramid lies, not just in its size, but in what it reveals about the Egyptian state around 2600 BCE. To feed, house, and organize this workforce for decades, the central government had to collect surplus grain and goods from across Egypt through a functioning tax system, store, redistribute, and transport these goods efficiently, maintain communication lines between Memphis, Giza, quarries, and far-flung regions like Aswan and Sinai, sustain political stability long enough for one measureless project to dominate a king's reign. The pyramid, then, is a frozen record of logistics. Every block is proof that someone counted, scheduled, and supplied. But why go to such extremes? The answer lies in religion and ideology. For Egyptians, the king's tomb was not merely a grave. It was a machine for eternity. The pyramid's internal chambers and passages, its orientation towards specific stars, and its surrounding temples all served one purpose: to secure the king's afterlife so that he could join the gods, especially the sun god Ra, and continue to care for Egypt. The Great Pyramid forms part of a complex that includes a valley temple near the Nile, where the king's body was received, a causeway rising from the valley through the desert, lined with reliefs and statues, a mortuary temple at the pyramid's base, where daily offerings were made to feed the king's ka, his life force. Priests serving in these temples, supported by land grants and endowments, performed rituals that symbolically renewed the king's power forever. In death, Khufu becomes an immortal partner of the gods, his well-being tied to the entire cosmos. If the king's afterlife is secure, the thinking goes, then Mot is secure. The Nile will continue to flood, the sun will rise, the seasons will turn, enemies will be repelled. Building the pyramid is therefore not just about one man's ego. It is a national act of cosmic maintenance. In this light, we can rewrite the Hollywood image. The builders of the Great Pyramid were not anonymous victims dragged to their doom. They were participants, willing or not, in a grand project that fused faith, obligation, and identity. Their labor fed the king's soul and, in theory, guaranteed the survival of the world they knew. The true story is in some ways more inspiring than the myths. A Bronze Age state, without iron, without wheels for heavy transport, without modern mathematics, coordinates resources on a continental scale to build, with human hands alone, a structure that still dominates the skyline after 4,500 years. The Great Pyramid stands as a monument not only to a single pharaoh, but to the power of organization itself. When we look at the pyramids, it's easy to see only kings and stone, but behind every block was a society in motion. At the base level stood the seasonal workers, farmers from villages up and down the Nile, whose fields lay under floodwater for part of the year. Drafted into teams, they traveled to royal sites like Giza, Saqqara, or Dahshur. Their days were long, hauling stone, mixing mortar, baking bread, brewing beer. But they were fed, housed, and in death, sometimes buried near the monuments they helped create. Above them were skilled craftsmen, stonemasons shaping blocks and statues, carvers incising hieroglyphs and relief scenes, woodworkers crafting sledges and tools. These specialists often lived closer to the work sites year-round, forming a kind of professional workforce. Overseeing it all were foremen and scribes. The foremen managed gangs of workers, setting tasks, maintaining discipline, ensuring that crews hit their quotas. Scribes recorded everything: how many blocks were delivered, how much bread was consumed, how many jars of beer were distributed. Their ink lines on papyrus and ostraca turned dusty labor into measurable data. Higher still stood nobles and top officials, the elite of the Old Kingdom. They held titles like overseer of works, steward of the king's estates, or vizier. In their own tombs, carved near royal pyramids, they proudly displayed scenes of their role in these great projects, standing with measuring rods, supervising rows of laborers, inspecting accounts. The very existence of pyramid projects of this scale implies a sophisticated system of law and taxation, even if we lack a written law code from this era like later Mesopotamian examples. To command workers from every province, to claim a portion of every harvest, to requisition donkeys, boats, and craftsmen, it all required rules. Who owed what, when, and to whom? What happened if they failed? How disputes were settled? We see the outlines of this system in the tomb inscriptions of officials who boast of having judged fairly, fed the hungry in times of shortage, or ensured that no one was robbed in my time. Mot, in the social sense, also meant justice among humans. Thus, beneath the shining limestone, the Old Kingdom was a living organism. Villages sending their sons, scribes bent over their palettes, nobles balancing ambition with loyalty, all knit together by the belief that serving the king's eternity served their own survival too. Yet even stone can hide fractures. By the end of the Old Kingdom, the very system that built the pyramids began to strain under its own weight. Colossal projects required colossal resources. Land and labor were diverted to support royal building and temple endowments. Over time, more and more estates were granted to officials and priests as tax-exempt domains, weakening the central treasury. At the same time, environmental stress may have struck. Evidence from climate records suggests that in the late 3rd millennium BC, Nile floods became less reliable. A series of poor inundations meant smaller harvests, tighter surpluses, and more pressure on ordinary farmers. Into this tension stepped the provincial governors, nomarchs. Originally appointed by the king to oversee each nome, many nomarchs began to treat their positions as hereditary. In their rock-cut tombs far from Memphis, they celebrated their local power, their own building projects, their own links to the gods. As royal authority faltered, these regional lords filled the vacuum. Loyalties shifted from the distant pharaoh to local patrons. The neat pyramid of power that once focused everything on the king began to tilt and fragment. The age of the pyramids had shown what a united, centralized Egypt could achieve. Now its very success, in wealth, in monuments, in devolved power, set the stage for something new. Political breakdown, regional rivalry, and a nation that would have to rediscover how to be one again. When the last great kings of the Old Kingdom died, the pyramids remained, but the system that built them cracked. Droughts and low Niles seemed to have struck Egypt around the end of the 6th dynasty. A river that once rose reliably enough to be called a god, now sometimes failed its people. Poor floods meant failed harvests. Failed harvests meant hunger, unpaid workers, and unrest. At the same time, provincial governors, the nomarchs, who had gained more land and wealth over generations, began to act like little kings in their own districts. The old balance between the royal court and the provinces was tipping. When the central power in Memphis weakened further, it did not simply hand over to a neat new dynasty. It splintered. In the north, at Heracleopolis, not far from modern Beni Suef, a line of rulers claimed to be the rightful heirs of Egypt. They took royal titles, maintained court rituals, and tried to hold together the traditions of the Old Kingdom. But their reach was limited. Their decrees, if they reached the far south at all, carried little weight. In Thebes, far up the Nile in Upper Egypt, another family rose. What began as powerful local governors there gradually elevated themselves into kings. They too claimed legitimacy, piety, and the right to rule the two lands. For almost a century, Egypt had two centers of royal authority, each with its own administration, its own gods favored above others, its own version of the story. Between and around these competing capitals, the countryside felt the strain. Without a single strong hand to guarantee order, local warlords and ambitious officials carved out pockets of power. Some were former nomarchs consolidating control. Others were military men who discovered that, in an age of weak kings, a band of loyal fighters could be more persuasive than a royal seal. Petty wars flared up over borders, irrigation canals, tax rights, and trade routes. One town's militia might trade another's granaries. A local clan, armed and desperate, might seize a temple storehouse. Even where outright fighting was rare, the mere threat of it hung over people's lives. Economic hardship bit deep. When harvests failed or armies passed through, peasants abandoned fields, fled to safer districts, or turned to banditry. Tomb inscriptions from some local rulers boast about how they fed the hungry in the year of famine and did not allow the poor to suffer. These are pious claims, but they hint at a reality where famine and social collapse were real possibilities. For ordinary Egyptians, this period must have felt like living between worlds. The ideology of the Old Kingdom claimed Egypt was a single, ordered whole, not made visible under a god-king. Now people saw multiple kings, temples sometimes looted, and officials who could not always protect them. The Great Pyramids still loomed over the Memphite plateau, but their message of unshakable stability rang hollow. Yet even in this fragmentation, some things continued. Farmers still sowed and harvested when they could. Scribes still copied texts. Priests still performed daily offerings to the gods, though perhaps with fewer fine goods and more anxiety about what tomorrow would bring. The machinery of Egyptian life did not stop. It just worked more roughly, with more hands on the controls and more friction in the gears. Out of this messy, painful era, new patterns of power and thought began to form, patterns that would reshape Egypt long after the Heracleopolitan and Theban kings stopped fighting. When central authority weakens, the periphery gets louder. In the first intermediate period, provincial elites stepped out of the shadow of the king. Their tombs, once modest compared to royal monuments, grew larger and more elaborate. Rock-cut tombs in places like Asyut, Beni Hassan, and Thebes show governors celebrating their own achievements, not just their loyalty to Pharaoh. Inscriptions proclaim, "I was a beneficent ruler. There was no hunger in my time. No one was harmed in my district." These are local kings in everything but name, presenting themselves as the immediate source of justice and protection for their people. Power, once imagined as flowing from a single point at Memphis, now seemed to bubble up from many wells. Religiously too, there was a shift. Local cults gained prominence. While great gods like Ra and Ta remained important, regional deities such as Montu at Thebes, or local forms of Horus and Hathor took on new political and emotional weight. Temples in the provinces became centers not only of worship but of administration and identity. To be a citizen of a particular town meant, more than ever, to belong to its god and its patron ruler. At the same time, something remarkable happened in literature. Texts traditionally grouped under pessimistic literature and social criticism either originate in or look back on this period. In the Admonitions of Ipuwer, a sage describes a world turned upside down, the poor rich, the rich poor, servants ruling, and violence stalking the land. "Behold, the river is blood," he laments. Men shrink from tasting it. Whether or not it is a literal description of the first intermediate period, it preserves the memory of chaos and moral shock. Another work, The Dialogue of a Man with His Ba, presents an individual so weary of life's injustices that he debates with his own soul about whether it is better to die. The fact that such a text could be conceived, copied, and valued tells us that Egyptians were thinking deeply about personal suffering, justice, and the meaning of existence. Even in two autobiographies, we see more self-reflection and moral claims. Officials emphasize not just their service to the king, but their fairness to the poor, their kindness to widows, their role in holding back violence. In a world where the king's power was less visible, personal ethics and local reputation mattered more. Culturally, the first intermediate period was not simply a dark gap between two golden ages. It was a laboratory. Political fragmentation forced communities to organize themselves, to empower local leaders, and to articulate new ideals of what good leadership meant. Literary voices dared to question whether the world truly reflected Mot or whether disorder had triumphed and what a just response might look like. When Thebes finally triumphed over Heracleopolis and Egypt was reunified under the early Middle Kingdom, the new kings inherited more than lands. They inherited these provincial elites, these local gods now swollen with prestige, and this sharpened awareness of how fragile order could be. The Middle Kingdom's later obsession with just kingship, care for the poor, and the dread of returning chaos is rooted here, in a time when Egypt actually broke apart and had to imagine from the ground up how it might be put together again. On a limestone cliff at Deir el-Bahri, opposite Thebes, a king had himself buried like a conqueror. His name was Mentuhotep II, and when he came to the throne, Egypt was no longer a single country. The Old Kingdom had collapsed generations earlier. In the north, rulers based at Heracleopolis controlled Lower Egypt and parts of Middle Egypt. In the south, Theban kings, Mentuhotep's ancestors, ruled Upper Egypt. Between them lay front lines, shifting alliances, and scars of civil war. Mentuhotep inherited not a united realm, but a divided battlefield. From his base in Thebes, he began a slow, relentless campaign to reclaim the two lands. In the early years of his reign, inscriptions record a cautious consolidation of the south. Garrisons at key points like Elephantine, officials loyal to Thebes placed in strategic nomes, offerings to Amun and other gods asking for victory. Then the fighting sharpened. One inscription speaks grimly of a year of the crime of Thenis, a reference to an uprising or brutal clash around Thenis, near Abydos, an ancient sacred city. Here, local loyalties and rival claims exploded into violence. Mentuhotep's forces had to reconquer, punish, and reassert control, inching their way northward. Imagine the marches, Theban soldiers advancing along the Nile, boats carrying supplies, scouts watching the banks for ambushes. Towns that sided with Heracleopolis risked siege. Others surrendered and were spared. Mud brick walls crumbled under battering rams. Fire, looting, and forced oaths followed. At some point, likely around the 14th to 20th years of his reign, the decisive blow fell. Heracleopolis was defeated, its royal house was broken, the symbols of northern kingship were taken, and the road to Memphis lay open. The Theban king now stood not just as lord of the south, but as ruler of a reunited Egypt. For ordinary people, reunification meant more than a line on a royal titulary. It meant caravans moving safely again, harvests not burned in raids, scribes returning to count grain instead of corpses. A farmer in Middle Egypt, who had watched tax collectors and soldiers from rival lords pass through his village, might suddenly find that there was once again only one king to serve. The memory of chaos did not vanish, but it receded, replaced by cautious hope that the world was settling back into its proper shape. Politically, Mentuhotep II had a choice: repeat the old kingdom's model of distant central power and powerful provincial lords, or learn from the collapse. He chose to learn. While he needed local elites to keep the country running, he moved carefully to limit their independence. Some nomarchs, those who had backed Thebes, were rewarded, but others saw their autonomy curtailed. High offices were more tightly tied to the royal court. Key posts were filled with men whose careers depended on the king's favor, not on inherited provincial power. Theban identity and religion gained a new significance in this process. The local god Amun, once a relatively modest deity, began to rise. As the god of the victorious reunifier's home city, Amun was increasingly cast as a national power, a hidden, mighty god whose will could shape the fate of Egypt. In later centuries, Amun-Re would become the supreme state god, but his ascent begins here, in the shadow of Mentuhotep's victories and Thebes' new prestige. Symbolically, the king made his point through ceremony and art. In reunification rituals, Mentuhotep appears wearing the double crown, performing the smiting of enemies, and embracing deities from both Upper and Lower Egypt. Reliefs show the unification symbol, the entwined papyrus and lotus plants, emphasizing that the two lands are bound together again. Art from his reign marks a shift. The famous statues of Mentuhotep from his temple show him as a compact, powerful figure, sometimes wrapped in the tight, enveloping garment of Osiris, god of the dead. The message is clear. This is not just a warlord, but a bringer of rebirth, of both the kingdom and cosmic order. His mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahri underlines this new identity. Built against the cliffs in terraces and colonnades, it fuses royal tomb, temple, and monumental propaganda. Processional ways, courtyards, and chapels all stage the story of a king who reunites Egypt and restores Mot. With Mentuhotep II, the Middle Kingdom begins not as a peaceful administrative reform, but as a hard-won victory, an Egypt reborn through siege, march, and calculated mercy. The trauma of civil war never quite leaves the political mind of this new era. It shapes how kings think about power, loyalty, and the dangerous strength of local lords. And it sets the stage for rulers who will not only govern Egypt, but turn it outward, toward Nubia, toward gold, and toward empire. A century later, another king stands on the deck of a royal boat, looking south toward the rocky cataracts of the Nile. His name is Senusret III, and his gaze is fixed on Nubia. If Mentuhotep II reunified Egypt, Senusret III weaponized it. Nubia, stretching south of the first cataract, was more than a neighbor. It was a corridor of gold, veins of precious metal in the eastern desert, routes to sub-Saharan Africa, and control over traffic along the river. Whoever dominated Nubia could tap a financial artery. Senusret III understood this with ruthless clarity. In his reign, we hear of multiple campaigns into Nubia, years 8, 10, 16, 19. The inscriptions boast of crushed enemies, ruined fields, and captured herds. These are not gentle border patrols. They are systematic demonstrations of force. But conquest alone was not enough. Senusret III built fortresses, from Buin near the Second Cataract down to Semna and beyond. The Egyptians constructed a chain of massive mud brick and stone strongholds. Their walls were thick, their gates controlled, their towers set to watch both river and desert. Each fortress had barracks, granaries, workshops, temples, officers' quarters. From one to another, signal fires or flags could relay messages. Together, they formed a military spine running through Lower Nubia. At Semna, a boundary stela carries the king's voice in stone. He boasts that no Nubian boat will pass this point northward without his permission, except for trading missions under strict control. The border is not just geographical. It is administrative, economic, and psychological. Within this fortified zone, Egyptian officials supervised gold mining, trade, and local populations. Nubian chiefs who cooperated were rewarded. Those who resisted felt the weight of Egyptian retaliation. All this required a state willing and able to stay on a permanent war footing. Under Senusret III, Egypt edges toward something new, a more militarized monarchy. He is often presented, in modern terms, as a proto-pharaoh general. His statues tell part of that story. Unlike the serene, idealized faces of earlier kings, Senusret III's portraits are strikingly different. His eyes are heavy-lidded, his cheeks sunken, his mouth set in a firm, almost grim line. Lines of age and worry crease his brow. This is not an eternal youth. It is a burdened commander. Scholars debate the exact message, but many see in these images a deliberate choice. A king who shows the strain of responsibility, who carries the weight of defending Egypt. The art emphasizes seriousness, vigilance, and the hard reality of rulership in a world of threats. Internally, Senusret III continued the project of curbing provincial power. Some nomarchal lines disappear from the record during or after his reign. Administrative divisions are redrawn. Royal officials' careers are more clearly tied to the central government, not to semi-independent local dynasties. The result is a tighter, more centralized state, funded by Nubian gold and trade tariffs, guarded by fortress garrisons, and personified by a king whose face looks out over conquered lands with an unblinking stare. Under Senusret III, Egypt is not just stable, it is sharp-edged. Yet the Middle Kingdom is remembered for more than armies and fortresses. In the quiet spaces between campaigns, something remarkable happens. Egypt turns inward, reflects on itself, and produces some of its most enduring literature and art. Take the tale of Senu. It begins with a crisis. The king has died abroad, and in the confusion, a courtier named Senu panics and flees Egypt. He crosses into foreign lands, lives among Asiatic tribes, marries, fights, prospers, and yet, all the while, longs for home. The story follows his inner turmoil, fear of royal punishment, nostalgia for the Nile, the pull of identity. Eventually, the new king summons him back, forgives him, and grants him an honored tomb. It's a tale of exile, loyalty, and the magnetic force of Egypt itself. Unlike the stiff, formulaic texts of earlier eras, Senu feels human. Its characters worry, change, and speak in vivid, personal voices. The king is still idealized, but we glimpse individual emotion, a Middle Kingdom taste for introspection. Other works go even deeper into the anxieties of the age. In the dialogue of a man with his ba, a speaker debates with his own soul about the value of life in a troubled world. He laments injustice and suffering, flirts with the idea of death as an escape, and is pulled back by the hope of meaning. It is a startlingly frank text. An Egyptian voice wrestling with despair and faith. The instruction of King Amenemhat, framed as advice from a murdered king to his son, mixes practical counsel with paranoia. The dead ruler warns his heir not to trust courtiers blindly, to be vigilant, to remember that conspiracy can lurk even close to the throne. Beneath the polished wisdom literature lies a raw memory of instability, and a clear fear of betrayal. Alongside these, instruction texts in general flourish, teachings of wise men to their sons or students. They offer advice on how to behave at court, how to lead justly, how to navigate a world where power can be both dangerous and necessary. Underneath their composed style lies a memory of past chaos and a desire to avoid it. This literary blossoming mirrors changes in art and religion. Temples become more standardized in layout and decoration. Certain motifs, like the king offering mot to the gods or processions of gnomes bringing offerings, are repeated and refined. The effect is a visual language that says, Egypt is orderly, stable, known. Statues of private individuals, too, show more personality. Officials and their wives sit or stand with subtle variations in expression, body type, and pose. They are not as individualized as modern portraits, but compared to Old Kingdom stiffness, there is a new warmth, a sense of people rather than types. Architecturally, Middle Kingdom rulers revive and reinterpret older traditions. They build pyramids again, smaller, often with mud brick cores, but surround them with complex temple systems. In places like Karnak, early versions of the Great Amun Temple begin to take shape, planting seeds for Egypt's future religious heart. All of this gives the Middle Kingdom an air of refinement. After the grand experiments and eventual collapse of the Old Kingdom, and the rough reunification of the First Intermediate Period, Egypt now seems to know itself better. It remembers what can go wrong, but it also sees what can be achieved when order holds. Its kings are warriors and administrators. Its scribes, thinkers, and storytellers. Its artisans heirs 2 centuries of experimentation. But power, wealth, and confidence send ripples beyond borders. Trade routes that carry Egyptian goods north and east also carry news of Egypt's riches. Foreigners come as merchants, mercenaries, and migrants. Some settle in the delta, forming communities that blend local and foreign ways. For now, they are guests in the house of the pharaoh. Soon, they will become something more. The Middle Kingdom's hard-won stability will draw in new players, and for the first time, Egypt will discover what it means to be ruled not by a native dynasty, but by outsiders. The first Hyksos did not arrive as conquerors. They came as merchants. In the bustling harbors of the eastern delta, boats from Canaan and Syria nudged up alongside Egyptian craft. Their crews spoke strange dialects, worshipped unfamiliar gods, and brought with them things Egypt wanted: timber from distant forests, fine oils, bronze weapons, livestock, and exotic goods from even farther east. At first, they were guests. Egypt, weakened by the slow unwinding of the Middle Kingdom, could still trade, but it no longer controlled its borders with the old iron grip. Provincial rulers bickered, central authority fumbled, and famine and instability left scars. Into this softening landscape, groups of Western Asiatic peoples, whom later Egyptians would call Hyksos, slipped in. They came not as a single invading army, but as families, clans, caravans. Some settled in the northern delta, taking Egyptian names or blending them with their own Semitic ones. Others worked as mercenaries in local armies or as overseers of flocks and herds. Their gods appeared alongside Egyptian deities in small shrines. Their foreign pottery showed up in Egyptian houses. Over time, a city in the eastern delta became their stronghold, Avaris. Avaris began as a trading hub, a place where Egyptian grain and gold met Levantine timber and copper. Its streets echoed with mixed accents. Its warehouses held goods from 2 worlds. Egyptian officials stationed there learned to bargain with foreign merchants who did not always respect traditional hierarchies. But as Egypt's internal troubles deepened in the 14th and 15th dynasties, the balance shifted. Local rulers in the delta leaned more heavily on these foreign allies. Some Hyksos chiefs gained titles, land, and militias of their own. What started as foreign quarter became foreign power base. And they had something Egypt did not: a new way of war. Along with their goods, Hyksos groups brought with them horses and chariots, fast, maneuverable platforms that could carry archers across the battlefield at speed. To those raised on the slow, steady march of infantry and river flotillas, the sight of horse-drawn chariots kicking up dust on the open plain must have been shocking. With the chariots came the composite bow, layers of wood, horn, and sinew glued together, producing a weapon with far greater range and power than traditional Egyptian self-bows. From a chariot, a skilled archer could pepper an enemy line from a distance, withdraw before they closed, and circle back to strike again. Imagine an Egyptian commander from the old school, watching his ranks break as arrows fall from beyond their own range, hearing the thunder of hooves where once there had only been the slow beat of sandals. The entire logic of battle was changing. As Egypt's central government faltered, the Hyksos capitalized. At some point in the 17th century BC, the leaders in Avaris stopped being merely overseers and rulers of foreign lands and began to claim an Egyptian title with a long sacred lineage, king. They adopted full royal titulary, wore Egyptian regalia, and presented themselves as legitimate pharaohs ruling from the north. Their names could blend Egyptian and Semitic elements. They worshipped their storm god under the name Seth, Egypt's own lord of desert and storm, merging identities in ways that must have felt unsettling to many natives. To some in the delta, this may have seemed a practical adjustment. Life went on, fields were plowed, taxes were collected. Avaris flourished as a cosmopolitan capital, filled with goods from across the eastern Mediterranean. But further south, in Thebes and beyond, a darker narrative took shape. Later Egyptian texts would call this period a humiliation, a time when Asiatics ruled over the 2 lands, when foreigners sat on the throne and native kings were reduced to vassals. Stories told of barbarians who did not know how to properly worship the gods, whose speech was harsh, whose customs were alien. Whether or not the Hyksos were truly as crude and destructive as later propaganda claimed, the emotional wound was real. For the first time in their long history, Egyptians had to confront a shocking possibility, that Egypt might not be destined always to rule itself. The Hyksos takeover was not just a political change. It was an identity crisis. It left behind memories of foreign accents in royal courts, strange soldiers on Egyptian soil, and a king whose bloodline did not reach back to the unifier Narmer but to lands beyond the Sinai. Those memories would fuel anger, fear, and eventually, a fierce determination to reverse the situation, no matter the cost. Hundreds of kilometers upriver from Avaris, in the old sacred landscape of Upper Egypt, Thebes watched and paid. The Theban rulers of the 17th dynasty, native Egyptian kings in a reduced realm, found themselves trapped in a humiliating arrangement. They controlled Upper Egypt, but the Hyksos in the north claimed the title King of all Egypt. To keep the peace, Thebes sent tribute, goods, perhaps even symbolic gestures of submission. One text, written later but echoing real tensions, tells of a Hyksos king in Avaris complaining that hippopotamuses in Thebes were disturbing his sleep with their bellowing and demanding that the Theban ruler do something about it. Whether or not this actually happened, the story captures the tone. A distant foreign overlord making petty, arrogant demands of a proud but constrained local king. In Thebes, such slights festered. Seqenenre-Tao, a Theban ruler, seems to have decided that enough was enough. His mummy, discovered in the 19th century, tells a grisly story. Deep wounds to the head, likely from battle axes and maces, suggest a violent death in combat, possibly against Hyksos forces. If so, he is a king who died not in bed but on the front lines of resistance. His struggle did not end with him. His successor, Kamose, picked up the banner. In stele from Kamosi's reign, we hear a voice of controlled fury. He rails against the absurdity of Egypt divided between a foreign king in the north and Nubian powers to the south, with Thebes squeezed between. He frames his campaign as a holy cause. To drive out the foreigners, to restore Egypt to itself. Kamosi's tactics were aggressive and flexible. Limited in resources compared to the Hyksos, he used a mix of riverine assaults, raids, and sieges. He struck northward, targeting Hyksos allies and supply lines, capturing towns that fed Avaris's strength. Egyptian ships filled with soldiers moved up the Nile, attacking key points and burning enemy ships. This was not yet a clean liberation. Kamosi's gains were significant but incomplete. Avaris itself remained in Hyksos' hands when he died, but he had changed the psychological map. The image of Thebes as merely a compliant vassal was gone. Resistance was now a royal duty. Into this world of unfinished struggles stepped a young king, Ahmose. He grew up in a royal house scarred by war, Seqenenre dead from head wounds, Kamose a warrior king whose campaigns had pushed the Hyksos back but not destroyed them. From childhood, Ahmose would have heard stories of foreign humiliation and heroic defiance, of the need for Egypt to be whole again. By his reign, Thebes had something new, experience with Hyksos technology. Egyptians had adopted the very tools that had once given the foreigners their edge: horses, chariots, composite bows. Now chariot squadrons flying Egyptian standards could race across the battlefield. Egyptian archers could meet Hyksos arrows with their own. Ahmose launched the final phase of the war. Sources from his time and later remember a long, grinding campaign. Avaris was besieged. Its defenders harried, its supply routes cut. Sieges in the ancient world were brutal affairs, hunger, disease, and fear working alongside swords and arrows. When Avaris finally fell, it was not the end, but a turning point. Ahmose pursued the fleeing Hyksos into southern Canaan, besieging their refuge at Sharuan and breaking their power there. The war had spilled beyond Egypt's old borders. In the act of expelling foreign rulers, Egypt had stepped onto the stage of Near Eastern politics as an emerging great power. For Egyptians, Ahmose was more than just a successful general. He was a liberator in temple reliefs and later traditions. He stands as the one who expelled the Asiatics and reunited the two lands. The shame of foreign rule was answered by a narrative of victory and restoration. The trauma of the Hyksos period did not vanish, but it was transformed into a foundational myth for what came next. The price of that victory would define the next era. A kingdom that had almost been swallowed by outsiders emerged more suspicious, more militarized, and more willing to project power beyond its borders to prevent such humiliation from ever happening again. From this crucible of invasion and resistance, the new kingdom would rise. A period when Egypt would not only defend itself but build an empire, and at its dawn stands Zamos, the last king of the second intermediate chaos and the first architect of a new imperial age. The new kingdom begins with a siege. On a cliff above the Nile at El-Kub, a man named Ahmose, son of Ebana, had his life story carved into stone. Line by line, he tells us how, as a young warrior, he sailed north in the ship Northern, in the presence of His Majesty. His king was also called Ahmose, and together they were going to drive out the Hyksos, the foreign rulers who had controlled the delta for generations from their capital at Avaris. By Ahmose's time, this was not a quick border skirmish. It was a grinding, all-or-nothing war of reconquest. Imagine Avaris, a sprawling city in the eastern delta, surrounded by canals, fields, and marshes. The Hyksos had brought new tools of war: the horse, the light 12-wheeled chariot, stronger composite bows. Now Egyptians, who had once faced these weapons with dread, were using them too. The siege combined river warfare, field maneuvers, and the brutal up-close violence of storming walls. Ahmose, son of Ebana, describes assaults by water and land. Pharaoh's fleet advanced along the canals, ships side by side, prows decorated, archers packed on deck. Infantry marched in step along the raised banks, shields slung over their shoulders, spears clenched. When the signal was given, archers blackened the sky with arrows to clear the battlements. Assault teams rushed forward with ladders, trying to gain a foothold on the enemy walls, while defenders pushed them back with stones, javelins, and boiling liquids. The inscription is matter-of-fact, but the details are chilling. Ahmose notes how many hands he cut from fallen enemies and presented to the king as proof of kills. Each hand could mean a reward: gold collars, slaves, or land. In this world, courage was measured in severed limbs. At last Avaris fell. Temples were purified, prisoners enslaved, and the Hyksos driven out of Egypt proper. Many kings might have stopped there, satisfied to have restored the old boundaries. Ahmose did not. The Hyksos leadership retreated northeast, across the Sinai, to the fortified city of Sharuan in southern Canaan. Ahmose pursued them into unfamiliar country. Rocky hills, sparse water, and cities perched on mounds, ringed with mud brick walls. There, Egyptian sources say, he besieged Sharuan for 3 years. 3 years of watchtowers and trenches. 3 years of burning surrounding crops, blocking wells, intercepting caravans. 3 years in which Egyptian soldiers learned how to fight and survive beyond the narrow band of the Nile Valley. When Sharuan finally fell, the Hyksos political power was broken. Out of this experience came a new strategic understanding. As long as powerful enemies could set up bases in the delta's doorstep, in Canaan or Syria, Egypt would never be truly safe. The Nile Valley, rich and narrow, was too easy to threaten. So Ahmose and his successors did something unprecedented. They stepped permanently beyond the old borders. Instead of withdrawing after victory, they left garrisons, established loyal vassals, and built a defensive belt of influence. To the south, they pushed into Nubia, retaking and strengthening a chain of fortresses and pushing beyond the old Middle Kingdom frontier. Nubia's gold, cattle, and soldiers began flowing northward again, now on a larger scale. To the northeast, they turned some Canaanite cities into client states, making their rulers swear oaths, pay tribute, and send troops when summoned. This was the birth of empire. The king was no longer just a shepherd of the Nile. He was a commander who thought in terms of buffer zones, outposts, and loyal allies abroad. The veterans of Avaris and Sharuan, like Ahmose, son of Ebana, were rewarded with grants of land, servants, and titles. Their estates became the seed of a new military aristocracy, loyal to the dynasty that had given them everything. The Old Kingdom had expressed royal greatness through pyramids. The early New Kingdom expressed it through conquest, garrisons, and an Egypt that now looked confidently beyond its horizons. A few decades after Ahmose's victories, Egypt saw another kind of revolution, not of chariots and sieges, but of gender and ideology. When Thutmose II died, his heir Thutmose III was only a child. Power could not simply sit vacant, so his stepmother and aunt Hatshepsut took charge as regent. At first, everything looked familiar. Reliefs show her standing respectfully behind the boy king, her titles those expected of a powerful queen: great royal wife, king's daughter, God's wife of Amun. Then, gradually, something very strange happens in the inscriptions. Hatshepsut begins to accumulate royal titles normally reserved for a male king. king of Upper and Lower Egypt, lord of the two lands. Scribes carve her names not in oval cartouches beside someone else's, but in the full formal fivefold titulary of a reigning monarch. Soon she is no longer just acting for Thutmose III. On temple walls, she appears as pharaoh in her own right. Artists struggle, then innovate, to show this new reality. In some scenes, Hatshepsut appears with a woman's body and clothing, accompanied by female pronouns. In others, she wears the kilt and crown of pharaoh, the ceremonial false beard strapped to her chin, and masculine pronouns are used. Ancient Egypt had no pre-made visual formula for a female king. Her sculptors and priests had to invent one. To justify such an unprecedented situation, Hatshepsut reaches for theology. At her splendid mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, 3 terraces of colonnades rise against the cliffs of western Thebes. Inside, a long series of reliefs tell a story. The god Amun visits her mother in the guise of the reigning king. The divine child conceived is Hatshepsut. Other scenes show oracles of Amun publicly proclaiming that she is to rule Egypt, chosen by the god himself. The message is clear and bold. My right to be king does not come from being my father's eldest son. It comes straight from the highest god. Her foreign policy reflects a different personality from the warrior kings before and after her. Hatshepsut did not abandon military action. There were campaigns in Nubia and perhaps minor expeditions elsewhere, but her proudest achievement was commercial, not martial, the expedition to Punt. Punt, probably located somewhere on the Red Sea coast in what is now Eritrea or Somalia, had long been a source of luxury goods, incense, ebony, ivory, gold, and exotic animals. Hatshepsut's reliefs at Deir el-Bahari show a flotilla of large, broad-hulled ships sailing from the Red Sea, their decks crowded with sailors, soldiers, and interpreters. The scenes of Punt itself are unusual and vivid. There are houses on stilts, palm trees arching over the shore, myrrh trees in full leaf. The chief of Punt, Pharaoh, and his notably stout wife, with her rolls of flesh carefully carved, greet the Egyptians bearing necklaces and tribute. Baboons, leopards, and panthers appear among the gifts. The ships return loaded with incense, gold, and most strikingly, live myrrh trees, whose roots are wrapped in baskets of Nile mud. Back in Thebes, these trees are planted in temple courts. Hatshepsut boasts that she has brought the very wonder of Punt into Amun's house. It is an extraordinary image, a queen king transforming foreign trade into permanent sacred landscape. At home, she builds relentlessly. 2 giant red granite obelisks, quarried at Aswan, are hauled hundreds of kilometers north and raised at Karnak Temple, their gilded tips flashing in the sun. She adds chapels, shrines, and pylons in temples up and down the Nile. Every stone whispers the same story: stability, abundance, divine favor. When Hatshepsut dies after more than 20 years of rule, Thutmose III finally exercises undivided power. In later years, he orders her names and images erased or reinscribed in many places. Statues are smashed or buried in pits. Scholars still debate his motives: political clearing of the record, theological discomfort, personal resentment. Whatever the reason, the attempt to silence her only half succeeds. The ruins of Deir el-Bahari and fragments of her statues show that, for a generation, Egypt accepted and even flourished under a woman on the throne who dared to wear the beard of a king. If Hatshepsut was the architect of temples and trade, Thutmose III became the architect of empire. Once in sole control, he moved quickly to reassert Egyptian dominance over Canaan and Syria. During Hatshepsut's long reign, some northern vassals had grown restless. The ruler of Kadesh, a mighty city on the Orontes River, forged a coalition with other princes and marched south, threatening Egypt's hold on the region. They gathered their forces near a strategic city, Megiddo. Thutmose's scribes carved a detailed account of this campaign on the walls of Karnak. It reads almost like a war diary. The Egyptian army moved north in divisions, each named for a god: Amun, Ra, Ta, and Sutek, and accompanied by chariot squadrons. Scouts reported that there were 3 possible routes to Megiddo. 2 were broad and safe, looping around the hills. The third, through the narrow pass at Aruna, was so tight that horses would go in single file. It was the obvious place for an ambush. Thutmose's officers urged him to take the safer roads. The king refused. "I shall proceed by the road of Aruna," he declared, "and let him who wishes to go by the other roads go. To go around would be to admit fear. To go through would be to gamble everything on daring and speed." For a day, the army threaded the ravine. Imagine the clatter of disassembled chariots dragged over rocks, the nervous glances at the ridges, the tension of men who know they are exposed. Had the coalition struck then, history might have ended very differently. But the enemy, expecting the Egyptians to avoid the dangerous route, left the pass lightly guarded. Thutmose emerged from the mountains with his leading division intact. At Megiddo, the coalition army was already deployed in the plain. The Egyptians barely had time to form proper ranks before the battle was joined. Chariots wheeled, arrows hissed, dust choked the air. As so often in ancient warfare, morale broke before numbers did. When the line of princes wavered, panic swept their troops. Drivers whipped their horses toward the city gate. Chariots snarled together in the crush, some overturned, nobles threw themselves out and scrambled up ropes and ladders, abandoning their gear. Egypt had won the field, but victory was not complete. Egyptian soldiers, seeing the rich enemy camp full of food, tents and treasure, turned to looting instead of pursuing the fugitives into the city. By the time order was restored, Megiddo's gates were closed and barred. What followed was a methodical siege. Thutmose ordered a circumvallation, a wall of branches that encircled Megiddo, cutting it off from outside help. Months dragged on. Starvation and disease did their slow work behind the walls. Finally, the princes of Canaan slipped out, crawling on their bellies in a ritual of submission, and surrendered. Thutmose's response shows the logic of empire. He did not massacre them. Instead, he took hostages, often their sons, back to Egypt, where they were raised at the royal court. There, in the shadow of Karnak, they learned Egyptian language, values, and religion. When they returned home as vassal kings, they were culturally tied to Egypt and personally indebted to Pharaoh. Over the next 20 years, Thutmose III campaigned again and again in Asia and Nubia. The annals list towns brought to heel, tribute extracted, and booty carried off. Horses, chariots, copper, silver, cedar wood from Lebanon, fine oils, glass, lapis lazuli, and ivory. From Nubia came gold in staggering quantities, branded cattle, ebony, leopard skins, and skilled archers pressed into Egyptian service. He did more than loot. He structured control. Forts were strengthened in Nubia. Administrative centers were set up. In Canaan and Syria, he placed Egyptian officials in key cities, took oaths from local rulers, and sometimes installed new leaders more loyal to him. Temples back home swelled with foreign wealth. At Karnak, he used some of that wealth to build ever more grandiose pylons, halls, and obelisks. By the time Thutmose III died, Egypt's influence stretched from near the fourth cataract of the Nile in the south to the vicinity of the Euphrates in the north. No previous pharaoh had ruled so wide a realm. Later scribes looked back on his reign as the model of what a warrior king could be: tireless, daring, and endlessly victorious. But empires do not stand still. What one generation conquers, the next must learn to hold. It is in the long peace after Thutmose III that we see how Egyptians tried to live with the power they had won, and how intellectual and religious changes would, eventually, shake that power from within. After the storms of conquest, Egypt entered a long season of sun. Amenhotep III inherited an empire already stretched to its greatest reach. The hard work of subduing vassals and securing frontiers had largely been done. What he received was a system that poured wealth into Egypt: gold from Nubia, timber and luxury goods from the Levant, exotic tribute from far-off lands whose kings wrote in anxious, flattering tones. This is the world reflected in the Amarna letters, clay tablets of diplomatic correspondence later found in Akhenaten's abandoned capital. Many are from Amenhotep III's reign. Foreign rulers address him as my brother, but the equality is mostly on paper. They ask for gold, as plentiful as the dust in Egypt, one king claims, and boast of the fine horses or daughters they offer in exchange. Marriage alliances link Egypt to Babylon, Mitanni, and other great powers. In these letters we glimpse a club of Bronze Age monarchs, but Amenhotep sits in its most opulent chair. Inside Egypt, that opulence is carved into stone and painted on palace walls. Amenhotep III built on an enormous scale. His mortuary temple on the West Bank at Thebes was once so vast that ancient tourists already marveled at its ruins centuries later. Today, only the Colossi of Memnon, 2 18-meter-high seated statues of the king, still tower over the fields. Their sheer size hints at the complex they once guarded. Courtyards, pillared halls, and sanctuaries now mostly vanished. He also expanded Luxor Temple, adding columned courts and statues that present him as the beloved of Amun. At Malkata, on the West Bank, He built a huge palace complex with reception halls, private apartments, artificial lakes, and gardens. Archaeologists have found floors painted with images of fish and birds, as if the king walked always above a living marsh. The effect must have been overwhelming, color, scent, music, and movement combining to create a royal world apart. Amenhotep III celebrated multiple said festivals, jubilees traditionally held in the 30th year of a king's reign to renew his strength and divine mandate. Reliefs show him running ritual races, seated in shrines, and embraced by gods. In statue after statue, his features become more serene, more godlike. Some show him with attributes of the sun god or as a form of the creator. The line between human king and deity blurs. Art of his reign reaches a classical balance, idealized but not yet strange, elegant but grounded. It feels like a culture supremely confident in its forms. Then his son came to the throne, and that confidence twisted into something far more radical. Amenhotep IV, who will rename himself Akhenaten, began in a familiar pattern, building at Karnak, honoring the traditional gods. But early on, he showed special devotion to one aspect of the sun god, the Aten, the visible solar disk. At first, the Aten might have been emphasized as a kind of royal sun deity. Soon, it became much more. In hymns carved on tomb walls, the Aten is praised as sole creator, the one true god whose light sustains all life. Other gods shrink in importance or disappear entirely from official texts. Amun, the great state god whose temples controlled massive wealth and manpower, is pushed aside. His name is sometimes even chiseled out of older inscriptions. Akhenaten's religious shift had a practical edge. By suppressing Amun's cult, he undercut the enormous power of the Amun priesthood in Thebes. By channeling resources into new Aten temples, he created a parallel hierarchy, loyal not to old traditions but to his vision. He made that break physical by founding a brand new capital, Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten, on a previously unused stretch of desert we now call Amarna. Boundary stelae carved into the cliffs around the site show Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti offering to the Aten and dedicating the whole valley to the god. He swore that this city was chosen by the Aten himself and that he would never move from it. Akhetaten grew rapidly. Its temples were open air, with altars under the direct sun rather than in dark enclosed sanctuaries. Palaces and official residences lined broad streets. Private houses sprang up in suburbs, their walls painted with gardens, pools, and household gods that stubbornly survived even in this monotheistic city. Art changed with belief. Akhenaten is shown with a long, narrow face, heavy lips, a distended belly, and almost androgynous form. Whether this reflected a medical condition, a deliberate stylistic choice, or theological symbolism is still debated. What's clear is that the old muscular ideal gave way to a fluid, exaggerated one. Nefertiti appears nearly as large and powerful as the king. The royal daughters cluster around them in affectionate, almost informal scenes, kissing their parents, tugging at their earrings, playing on their laps. These images feel intimate in a way earlier royal art never did, and they reflect a new focus, the royal family as the sole proper worshippers of the Aten, intermediaries for all humanity. But while Akhenaten poured energy into theology and art, cracks widened elsewhere. The same Amarna letters that speak of Amenhotep III's prestige also record, a generation later, the anxieties of Egypt's vassals, rulers in Canaan and Syria write to Akhenaten. The king of Hatti has invaded, the Habiru plunder my lands. Why have you not sent archers? Why is there no king here? Sometimes they are answered. Often they seem to be ignored or fobbed off. Egypt's presence in the north grows thinner. Enemies probe, local strongmen rise, and cities that once feared the pharaoh feel his shadow less and less. Within Egypt, the marginalization of powerful temples and priesthoods must have created deep resentment. For centuries, the mutual support between palace and priesthood had sustained the state. Akhenaten's reforms broke that alliance. When a ruler attacks not just the gods but the institutions that feed, employ, and define thousands of people, he creates enemies with long memories. In less than 2 generations, Egypt traveled from Amenhotep III's self-assured luxury to Akhenaten's stark experiment in monotheism. It was as if an empire at its zenith had suddenly decided to reinvent its own soul, with consequences it could not fully control. When Akhenaten died, his new order did not long survive him. Behind a haze of uncertain succession, a brief reign by a figure named Smenkhkare, perhaps, and the powerful presence of Nefertiti or other royals, one clear figure finally emerges, a young boy with a loaded name, Tutankhaten, living image of Aten. Very soon, that name changes in official documents to Tutankhamen, living image of Amun. The symbolism could not be clearer. Under the guidance of senior officials, the court announces a return to the old gods and the old capital regions. A famous proclamation, the Restoration Stela, declares that the temples had been neglected, their shrines fallen into ruin, their offerings stopped. Now it proclaims, the king has repaired them, re-endowed their estates, and restored proper worship. Behind the boy king stand experienced hands, the Vizier, an elder statesman who had already served Akhenaten, and the General Hormizd play leading roles in steering policy. In reliefs, they appear close to the throne, performing rituals alongside Tutankhamen. It is easy to imagine that they, and others like them, were the true architects of the restoration, men whose careers had been disrupted by the Amarna Revolution and who now saw a chance to rebuild both the cults they believed in and the political system that supported them. The capital begins to shift back from Akhenaten to Memphis and Thebes. Work gangs and treasure trains strip useful materials from the Aten city. Blocks bearing Akhenaten's name, once part of his temples, are reused as filler in new building projects. Statues of old gods, long stored or damaged, are repaired and reinstalled. The very landscape seems to shrug off Akhenaten's imprint. Tutankhamen himself, however, does not live long. He probably dies in his late teens. His body shows signs of illness or injury. Theories about his death range from accident to complications of congenital problems. Politically, his reign is a bridge, short but crucial in renormalizing the relationship between king, gods, and priests. In his own time, he was one more minor pharaoh in a line of many. In ours, he is almost synonymous with ancient Egypt, and that is because of what happened more than 3,000 years after his burial. In 1922, after years of searching in the Valley of the Kings, the archaeologist Howard Carter uncovered the sealed entrance to Tutankhamen's tomb. The small doorway, the intact royal seal on the plaster, the passage choked with debris, all hinted at something rare. When the first glimpse came through a small breach, Carter famously said he saw wonderful things. Those wonderful things were the material residue of New Kingdom belief. The antechamber was crammed with furniture, chariots, boxes, and statues piled haphazardly, as if the living had jammed every useful and symbolic item they could into a limited space. Gilded couches with animal heads, chariots with inlaid decoration, boxes painted with scenes of the king hunting and in battle, all were there, ready for use in the next life. Beyond a sealed doorway lay the burial chamber, where a stone sarcophagus was nested inside a series of gilded wooden shrines, like enormous box-shaped Russian dolls. Within the sarcophagus, 3 coffins, one inside the other, embraced the mummy. The innermost coffin was made of solid gold. Covering the head and shoulders of the wrapped body was the famous gold mask, its inlaid eyes and lapis-colored stripes staring serenely across millennia. In a side room, the treasury, for canopic jars with lids carved as Tutankhamen's head held his embalmed organs. Protective goddesses wrapped their stone arms around the shrine that housed them. Rows of Shabti figures lined shelves and filled boxes. Little servant statues inscribed with spells promising they would answer in the king's place when work was demanded in the afterlife's fields. Every object was practical in a ritual sense. Furniture to sit and sleep on, clothing to wear, chariots to ride, food and wine to consume, games to play, weapons to wield, images of protectors to ward off harm, texts to guide the soul. The Egyptians had always treated death as a transition requiring enormous preparation. Tutankhamen's hurried but almost intact burial lets us see what that preparation actually looked like for a new kingdom king. Ironically, the very things that made his reign modest in life, his youth, his short time on the throne, the political overshadowing by others, helped preserve his tomb. A minor, quickly sealed burial in a valley already crowded with royal graves escaped most ancient looters. For us, it has become a time capsule of belief at the height of the new kingdom. If Tutankhamen is the most famous pharaoh today, Ramses II was the most famous in his own. Ramses came to the throne after Hormizd, and the short reign of Ramses I and Seti I had already begun to restore Egypt's military prestige. Seti had campaigned successfully in Canaan and Syria. His son inherited both a tradition of war and a need to assert dominance against a powerful rival, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia and northern Syria. Early in his long reign, he ruled for around 66 years, Ramses led a major campaign north that culminated in the Battle of Kadesh. This city, perched near a bend of the Orontes River, controlled vital routes between Egypt's sphere and that of the Hittites. Ramses advanced with a large army, organized into divisions named after gods. Moving ahead with the Amun division, he sent scouts forward. Two captured deserters from the enemy told him that the Hittite king was far away, afraid to face him. This was a lie. The main Hittite force, including heavy chariotry, was actually concealed close by. Confident, Ramses allowed his army to stretch out along the route. The Ra division lagged behind. The Ta and Set divisions were further back. As the Amun division began to make camp near Kadesh, the Hittite chariots surged out and smashed into the unwary Ra division, scattering it. Then they wheeled toward Ramses' camp. What followed, according to Egyptian accounts, was a moment of near disaster. Ramses, isolated with only a fraction of his troops, had to rally his men and personally charge the enemy. Reliefs show him alone in his chariot, bow taut, horses galloping, enemies tumbling under his wheels. He calls on Amun, accusing the god of abandoning him, and then exulting when divine help strengthens his arm. In reality, the arrival of allied troops, the mysterious Niran, possibly mercenaries or vassal forces, played a key role in stabilizing the situation. The Egyptians rallied. The Hittite chariots suffered losses and withdrew across the river. Neither side took Kadesh. The battle was, militarily, a stalemate. Politically, Ramses refused to let that happen. He ordered detailed battle accounts inscribed in multiple temples across Egypt, at Abu Simbel, Luxor, Karnak, the Ramesseum, and others. These narratives, accompanied by sprawling relief scenes, turned Kadesh into a story of heroic victory. The panic of the troops is acknowledged only as a foil to the king's unwavering courage. The enemy's flight is emphasized, the ambiguous ascending downplayed. Anyone walking through New Kingdom temples would encounter this version again and again. Ramses the Mighty scattering foes with divine backing. Years later, pragmatism tempered glory. Egypt and Hatti both faced other threats and recognized that endless war between them was costly. They negotiated a peace treaty, the earliest surviving treaty whose text we have from both sides. The clauses are surprisingly modern: mutual non-aggression, alliance in case of third-party attack, extradition of refugees and criminals, mutual oaths before the gods. Ramses married a Hittite princess to seal the agreement. The two empires entered a period of cold but stable peace. At home, Ramses spent lavishly on construction and self-promotion. He completed work at Karnak and Luxor, often putting his own cartouches on older monuments. He built his own mortuary temple on the West Bank, the Ramesseum, stuffed with statues and reliefs. Across Egypt and Nubia, he raised temples and colossal statues. The most spectacular is the rock-cut temple at Abu Simbel, where four-seated colossi of Ramses gaze out over what is now Lake Nasser. Twice a year, the rising sun's rays penetrate the temple's inner sanctuary to illuminate the statues of gods and the king, a stone-built drama of cosmic harmony and royal divinity. His building program was not just vanity. It was policy. Every colossal statue, every inscribed scene, proclaimed his power to subjects and enemies alike. Temples anchored Egyptian presence in Nubia and along trade routes. Reliefs depicting him smiting enemies, Libyans, Asiatics, Nubians, sea peoples, reinforced the message that Egypt's borders were guarded by a tireless warrior king. Yet beneath this glitter, strains show, maintaining garrisons in distant territories, supplying vast building projects, and supporting a huge royal family. Ramses fathered dozens of children, required massive resources. In his later years and after his death, successors struggled to match his scale. Abroad, new forces were stirring. Groups we call the Sea Peoples were raiding and migrating across the eastern Mediterranean. Old powers like the Hittites would soon collapse entirely. Ramses II stands near the crest of a long wave. Behind him lie the secure conquests of Thutmose III and the confident piety of Amenhotep III. Before him, though he could not see it fully, was an age of instability and gradual contraction. To walk today among the ruins of his temples is to feel both impressions at once. On the one hand, an almost overwhelming assertion of permanence, gigantic stone bodies, names carved everywhere, scenes of eternal victory. On the other, the knowledge that not many generations after his death, Egypt's empire would begin to unravel, its kings forced to fight not for dominance abroad but for survival at home. The New Kingdom reached its peak in this period of warrior pharaohs, global diplomacy, bold experiments, and monumental art. Its decline would be slower and more complex, but the seeds were already there, even as Ramses' statues still stare out with unblinking stone eyes, as if nothing could ever change. The new kingdom didn't end with a bang, it sagged. After the long line of Ramesside pharaohs, the last of them, Ramses XI, died around 1070 BCE. On paper, Egypt still had a king, a court, and the old rituals. In reality, something essential had snapped. The single chain of command that had once run from Memphis and Thebes all the way to Nubia and the Delta simply stopped working. The clearest sign of the New World came from Thebes, city of Amun. For centuries, the high priest of Amun at Karnak had been one of the most powerful men in Egypt, but always, theoretically, second to the king who appointed him. As central authority weakened, that relationship reversed. The temple of Amun owned huge estates, workshops, herds, and fleets of boats. It employed thousands of priests, scribes, guards, and laborers. When royal power faltered, this temple state did not. Men like Herihor, then his successors such as Piank and Penujum I, began as royal officials and ended as something closer to kings in all but name. Herihor, a general turned high priest, had his images carved on temple walls in full royal style. Wearing the double crown, smiting enemies, surrounded by divine hieroglyphs. Penujum I was buried in the Valley of the Kings, the traditional cemetery of pharaohs, with a lavish coffin and funerary equipment that would not have embarrassed a new kingdom king. The office of high priest, once an appointment, became hereditary. Fathers passed it to sons. Amun's domain in Upper Egypt became a semi-independent principality. The high priests issued their own decrees, dated by their own regnal years. They commanded troops, negotiated with Nubian chiefs, and recycled royal burials, stripping gold from vulnerable New Kingdom tombs under the pious excuse of protecting the mummies, then rewrapping and reburying them in hidden caches. Meanwhile, far to the north, a different royal house claimed to be the true heirs of the pharaohs. At Tanis in the eastern delta, kings of the 21st dynasty ruled from a city that had inherited much of the population and prestige of Pyrameses, the former Ramesside capital. They held the traditional royal titulary, maintained a court, conducted diplomacy, and were recognized abroad as pharaohs of Egypt. Their tombs at Tanis, discovered in the 20th century, show that they still enjoyed considerable wealth. Silver coffins, gold masks, and jewelry rival the treasures of earlier ages. But their grip on the country was weak. The Tanite king's authority rarely reached much beyond the Delta and northern Nile Valley. In the south, their names might be honored in formal inscriptions, but real power lay with the high priests at Thebes. In some documents, you see the awkward compromise. An official's title might mention both the king of Upper and Lower Egypt at Tanis and the high priest of Amun in Thebes, as if the writer is hedging bets, acknowledging both suns in the sky. The result was a kind of double exposure Egypt. Two courts, two centers of gravity, overlapping claims. A decree issued in Tanis might be quietly ignored in Thebes. An appointment made by the high priest could be meaningless north of Abydos. Local governors, especially in Middle Egypt, learned to navigate this divided landscape, playing one side against the other or quietly carving out their own spheres of autonomy. Culturally, this fragmentation produced subtle differences. In the north, royal art and architecture at Tanis tried to continue New Kingdom traditions on a smaller scale. In the south, Theban art emphasized Amun even more heavily, with temple reliefs and hymns glorifying his priests and their families. The bureaucracy of Amun's domain, with its scribes, treasurers, and overseers of fields and granaries, looked more like a royal administration than a mere temple staff. Beyond Egypt's borders, others were watching. To the west, Libyan groups who had long served as mercenaries and settlers in the delta saw their chance. Their chiefs accepted Egyptian titles, married local women, and blended into the patchwork of northern politics. To the south, in Nubia, the old Egyptian fortresses and temples were now outposts of a different power, the rising kingdom of Kush. The third intermediate period begins then, not with barbarian hordes smashing into a helpless land, but with Egypt's own structures bending under their own weight. Temples kept the machinery of religion running. Local elites kept irrigation systems and harvests going. Society did not collapse. But the idea of a single, unquestioned pharaoh ruling from one center had become a memory. Egypt had entered an era of priests and princes. multiple authorities, partial loyalties, and a slow, uneven draining of the central power that had once made it an empire. Into this fractured landscape stepped new rulers whose ancestors had once been outsiders. For generations, Libyan groups had grazed their herds along Egypt's western frontier. Some had been hired as mercenaries by Ramesside pharaohs. Others had drifted into the delta as migrant communities. Over time, many of these families settled permanently, trading tents for mud-brick houses and tribal names for Egyptian titles. Their chiefs served as local commanders and governors, learned Egyptian, and worshipped Egyptian gods, especially those of their home districts. By the 10th century BC, some of these Libyan Egyptian elites were powerful enough to think beyond local office. One of them, a man named Shoshenq, emerged as the most successful. He held the old Libyan title Great Chief of the Meshwesh, the name of his tribe, but he also married into the Tanite royal house and placed his relatives in key priestly posts, including in Thebes. Around 945 BCE, he took the final step, adopting full royal titulary. He proclaimed himself king of Upper and Lower Egypt, founding what we call the 22nd dynasty. In Egyptian, his name was written neatly in hieroglyphs. On foreign lips it would become Shishak, remembered in the Hebrew Bible as the pharaoh who invaded Judah and plundered Jerusalem. At Karnak, Shoshenq I had a monumental relief carved listing the towns he claimed to have subdued in Canaan. The scene is pure pharaonic tradition, the king smiting Asiatic captives, a catalogue of place names in bound ovals. A Libyan origin ruler was now presenting himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the latest in a long line of Egyptian kings defending and expanding the land. The Libyan dynasties that followed, fragmented 22nd, overlapping 23rd, and short-lived 24th, were less about invasion and more about integration. Their rulers bore Egyptian throne names, dedicated statues to Amun and other gods, and were buried in Egyptian-style tombs. They endowed temples, sponsored festivals, and used the language of restoring order and making firm the two lands. At the same time, they did not forget their roots. Many continued to use Libyan titles alongside royal ones and maintained extended kin-based power networks. Instead of a strict father-to-son succession, you often see multiple princes ruling simultaneously in different regions, all related through sprawling families. This made for flexible alliances and constant rivalries. The map of Egypt looked like a mosaic of Libyan Egyptian principalities, priestly domains, and nominal royal centers, all jostling for position. While Libyan-descended rulers were weaving themselves into Egypt from the north and west, another power was rising far to the south: Kush. In the centuries after the New Kingdom withdrew from Nubia, the region had not reverted to some imagined primitive state. Instead, the local kingdom of Kush, centered first at Napata near the Fourth Cataract, grew strong. Its kings built temples to Amun patterned on Theban models, wrote inscriptions in Egyptian hieroglyphs, and adopted the full regalia and titulary of pharaohs. Their pyramids, smaller and steeper than the ancient ones at Giza, began to dot the desert near their capital. By the 8th century BC, Kushite kings looked north and saw an Egypt divided, its sacred traditions compromised by squabbling Libyan houses. They framed their ambitions not as conquest, but as restoration. A king named Pi or Pianki left us a long inscription describing his campaign into Egypt. Written in elegant late Egyptian, it is as much sermon as war report. Pi sails down the Nile with his forces, subduing cities one by one. Local princes and Libyan rulers, who had been fighting each other, now confront a new kind of enemy, a southern king who claims to be more authentically Egyptian than they are. Pi refuses to eat the bread of a city that does not properly purify itself for Amun. He criticizes northern shrines for lax rituals. He stands in temples, making offerings, reading oracles, and presenting himself as the true champion of Mot, order, truth, the cosmic balance. When rival rulers submit, he has them prostrate themselves before him and kiss the ground, then confirms many of them in their posts under his supremacy. This is less an annihilation than an ideological takeover. By the time his successors, especially Shabaka and Taharka, have finished the work, Egypt is, on paper, reunited under the 25th dynasty, ruled from Napata. Kushite kings wear the double crown, adopt Egyptian throne names, and fill temples in Thebes and Memphis with their images. Yet they also display distinctive Kushite features: tight curled hair under a cap crown, a double uraeus cobra on the brow to signify dual heritage, and references to Nubian deities alongside Amun and Ra. From their point of view, they had come not to loot a weakened neighbor, but to rescue an ancient civilization from its own decline. To put a stop to division, revive proper worship, and restore the dignity of kingship. The rest of the Near Eastern world, however, had other plans. To the northeast, the Assyrian Empire was rising, far more ruthless and systematically militarized than anything Egypt had faced before. Pi's successors found themselves dragged into power struggles in the Levant, confronting Assyrian armies on foreign soil. Campaigns seesawed, Egyptian and Kushite forces tried to prop up client rulers, Assyrian kings pushed back hard. Eventually, the Assyrians came straight for Egypt itself. In 671 BCE, they captured Memphis and briefly drove Taharka's forces south. In the following decades, their interventions shattered Kushite control in the north. A new line of local delta rulers, backed, tolerated, or at least not immediately crushed by Assyria, would inaugurate the late period. For Egypt, the Third Intermediate Period was thus not a simple story of foreign domination or sudden collapse. It was for centuries in which power slipped from a single center into many hands. Priests, Libyan chieftains turned pharaohs, Nubian kings turned restorers, even as Egyptian culture, religion, and language continued almost unbroken. The slow decline was real. Territory lost forever, unity rarely more than temporary, foreign armies eventually marching through the heartland. But from Tanis to Thebes to Napata, each new ruler still wrapped themselves in the old symbols of Mot and the double crown, insisting that they, this time, would be the one to make Egypt whole again. In the Third Intermediate Period, Egypt was no longer the unrivaled power of earlier ages, but it was not yet a mere province either. Instead, it became a contested legacy, a land whose symbols, temples, and crowns were claimed by Libyan chiefs, Nubian kings, and soon by new empires rising to the northeast. In the next chapters, we follow Egypt as it passes from the hands of its own rulers into those of Assyrians, Persians, and finally the Greeks, who all tried in their own ways to possess the immortality of the pharaohs. By the 7th century BC, Egypt was no longer the terrifying superpower that had once sent armies into Syria and Nubia. Instead, it sat at the edge of a new kind of world. One of gigantic land empires stretching from the mountains of Iran to the shores of the Mediterranean. At the heart of this new order stood Assyria. The Assyrians, based in northern Mesopotamia, had built a war machine unlike anything Egypt had ever faced. Their kings, Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal, commanded standing armies with iron weapons, siege engines, chariots, and professional infantry. They ruled through terror as well as administration. Mass deportations, floggings, impalements, and city burnings, all proudly recorded in stone reliefs. Egypt, divided between Libyan and then Kushite rulers, became both prize and battleground. Kushite pharaohs like Taharka tried to extend their influence into the Levant, supporting local kings who resisted Assyrian domination. To Assyria, this was intolerable. Egypt was not just a rich land of grain and gold. It was a dangerous meddler in their western provinces. In 671 BCE, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon marched his army to the Nile Delta. His annals describe crossing deserts, building bridges over canals, and forcing river crossings under enemy attack. After heavy fighting, his forces captured Memphis, the old capital, and claimed to have carried off members of the royal family as prisoners, along with vast spoils. For the first time, an army from Mesopotamia had smashed its way into the Egyptian heartland. Assyrian control was never as stable as their inscriptions boasted. They installed and deposed local rulers in the delta, fought repeated revolts, and struggled with the sheer distance from their core territories. But their campaigns shattered the unity and prestige of Kushite rule in Egypt. Eventually, the Kushite kings retreated fully to Nubia, where the kingdom of Kush would continue on its own path for centuries more. Into the vacuum stepped a new local line, the Sate kings of the 26th dynasty, based at Sais in the western delta. They initially owed their position to Assyrian favor, but as Assyria declined under internal strife and new enemies, these Sate kings asserted greater independence. Under rulers like Psamtik I and Necho II, Egypt experienced a brief renaissance. Fortifications were restored, trade re-energized, and foreign mercenaries, especially Greek soldiers, were welcomed as allies. Yet while Egypt enjoyed this Sate revival, a still greater power was rising further east, the Persian Empire. In the mid-6th century BC, Cyrus the Great overthrew the Medes and began assembling a realm that would stretch from Central Asia to the Aegean. His successors, Cambyses and Darius, inherited both his ambitions and his appetite for expansion. Egypt, wealthy and strategically placed at the gateway to Africa and the Mediterranean, was an obvious target. In 525 BCE, Cambyses led a Persian army into Egypt. Accounts from Greek authors are dramatic and not always reliable, but the outline is clear. After a decisive battle near Pelusium in the eastern delta, Persian forces broke Egyptian resistance. The last Saite king, Psamtik III, was captured. Memphis fell. Egypt became a satrapy, a province of the Achaemenid Empire. Under Persian rule, Egypt was governed by satraps who represented the great king. The Persians did not try to erase Egyptian culture. Temples remained active, priests continued rituals, hieroglyphic inscriptions were still carved. Persian kings like Darius I sponsored building works, left inscriptions in Egyptian style, and sometimes had themselves depicted making offerings to Egyptian gods. They understood that ruling Egypt meant cooperating with its powerful priesthoods and respecting its traditions, at least outwardly. Yet the change in status was immense. For the first time in its long history, Egypt was no longer even theoretically the center of its own universe. Its king lived far away in Persepolis or Susa. Decisions about taxes, foreign wars, and high appointments were made beyond the Nile Valley. Egypt's soldiers fought, not for their own pharaoh's ambitions, but in Persian campaigns against rebels in other corners of the empire. The late period in this phase was a time of adaptation, an ancient civilization learning to exist under foreign emperors who claimed not just to rule Egypt but to rule the world. Foreign rule never went uncontested. Egypt, with its deep memory of independent kingship and its fiercely rooted priesthoods, repeatedly tried to shake off imperial control. Already under the Persians, revolts flared. Local leaders and princes proclaimed themselves pharaoh, rallied troops, and sought allies among the Greeks or other enemies of Persia. For brief moments, they succeeded in creating what modern historians call native dynasties, short-lived periods when Egyptian rulers again sat on the throne. In the late 5th and early 4th centuries BC, two such revivals stand out. The 28th dynasty consisted of a single king, Amartius, who led a successful rebellion and ruled from Sais. He was followed by the 29th and 30th dynasties, based further north at Mendes and then Sebennytos. These kings adopted full pharaonic titulary, funded temples, and presented themselves as restorers of Maat, driving out the foreigner and renewing Egypt's ancient gods. They were not merely nostalgic figureheads. Some, like Nectanebo I and Nectanebo II of the 30th dynasty, proved energetic rulers. They built or restored temples across the country. Reliefs with their names still adorn walls at Philae, Karnak, and other sites. They strengthened fortifications in the delta, knowing that any new invasion would come from Asia. They hired large numbers of Greek mercenaries, recognizing that the balance of military power in the eastern Mediterranean now depended heavily on hoplite infantry and naval forces. For a while, it seemed possible that Egypt might survive as an independent regional kingdom, playing Persia and the Greek city-states against each other, using its wealth and strategic position as leverage. But beneath these flashes of revival lay persistent weaknesses. Politically, power was fragmented among influential families, priestly networks, and regional elites. Succession was not always smooth. Rival claimants and local warlords could quickly turn a crisis into civil conflict. Economically, the demands of war, fortifying borders, paying mercenaries, rebuilding after invasions, weighed heavily on the treasury. Maintaining independence in a world of giant empires was expensive. Culturally, Egypt still possessed enormous prestige, but it was no longer the unquestioned trendsetter of the eastern Mediterranean. Greek philosophers, travelers, and mercenaries came to Egypt in growing numbers, fascinated by its antiquity, yet also bringing with them new military techniques, artistic styles, and ideas. Egyptian elites sometimes adopted Greek customs or sought Greek support, tying their fortunes to alliances that could shift with dizzying speed. Above all, the strategic situation kept worsening. The old enemy, Assyria, had long since collapsed under the combined weight of Babylonians and Medes. Persia, though shaken by revolts and wars with Greek city-states, remained a colossus. Even when temporarily weakened, it could return in force. After several decades of fragile independence, Persia did exactly that. In 343 BCE, under Artaxerxes III, Persian armies invaded again. Despite the efforts of Nectanebo II, the last native pharaoh, Egyptian resistance collapsed. Nectanebo fled to Nubia, the Persians re-established control. Egypt once more became a satrapy. In Egyptian king lists, this moment marks the end of the 30th dynasty, the last fully native line to rule a united Egypt. Yet history was moving quickly. Barely a decade later, a new conqueror appeared, Alexander of Macedon. By the time Alexander marched into Egypt in 332 BCE, the Persians were exhausted by his string of victories in Asia Minor and the Levant. The Persian satrap in Egypt offered little resistance. Some accounts suggest that Egyptians, resentful of Persian rule, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. Whether or not that enthusiasm was universal, the result was clear. Control of Egypt passed from Persian hands to those of a Greek king. With Alexander's conquest, Egypt's late period, the age of Assyrian shock, Persian Empire, and flickering native revivals, came to an end. What followed was not the disappearance of Egyptian culture, but its transformation. Under the Ptolemies, Greek and Egyptian worlds would intertwine in new and sometimes surprising ways. For more than 3 centuries, Egypt had struggled to remain itself in a world of massive, expanding empires. It had resisted, adapted, briefly revived, and then succumbed. The land of the Pharaohs was now part of a larger Mediterranean story, its ancient gods and symbols reinterpreted under foreign crowns, yet still remarkably alive. When Alexander the Great arrived at Egypt's borders in 332 BCE, he entered a land weary of foreign satraps and imperial wars. For nearly 2 centuries, Egypt had been tugged back and forth between Persian domination and brief native revivals. Persian rule, especially in its later phases, had left many Egyptian elites resentful. Alexander's timing could not have been better. His conquest of Egypt was astonishingly swift. After breaking Persian power in Asia Minor and the Levant, he marched south along the coast. By the time he reached the eastern delta, the Persian satrap in Egypt knew that resistance was hopeless. Ancient sources suggest that Alexander encountered little organized opposition. Some cities opened their gates. Local elites recognized in him a new master, one who came as the triumphant enemy of their old enemy, Persia. Alexander understood the importance of symbolism as well as force. In Memphis, he participated in traditional Egyptian ceremonies. He made offerings to the Apis bull, a sacred manifestation of the god Ptah. Egyptian priests hailed him as pharaoh and linked him to the line of earlier kings, presenting his rule as a restoration of divine order rather than another episode of foreign oppression. For Alexander, being accepted as an Egyptian king enhanced his prestige. He could now present himself not just as a conqueror, but as a legitimate heir to one of the world's most ancient thrones. Yet Alexander's most enduring act in Egypt was not a battle or a coronation, but the founding of a city, Alexandria. On the Mediterranean coast, near the western edge of the Nile Delta, he chose a site between the sea and Lake Mareotis, close to the island of Pharaohs. There, according to later stories, Alexander himself traced the city's layout with flour or barley meal, marking streets and public spaces. Whether or not the tale is literally true, it captures his intent. Alexandria was to be a planned city, a Greek city, and a great port linking Egypt's agricultural wealth to the broader Mediterranean world. Strategically, Egypt was now one of the jewels of Alexander's rapidly expanding empire. Its grain could feed armies and cities. Its gold and papyrus could fuel trade and bureaucracy. Its position at the crossroads of Africa, the Near East, and the Mediterranean made it a crucial hub. Symbolically, ruling Egypt allowed Alexander to wrap himself in the prestige of its ancient religious traditions. He even visited the oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis in the western desert, where, according to legend, he was greeted as the son of the god. Alexander did not stay long. Within a few months, he left to pursue his campaigns further east, into Mesopotamia, Iran, and beyond. But his brief Egyptian interlude left a deep imprint. Alexandria would become the capital of a new kind of Egypt, one ruled by Greek-speaking kings, shaped by Hellenistic culture, but still anchored in the soil and temples of the Nile. Alexander's sudden death in 323 BCE shattered his empire into fragments. His generals, the Diadochi, fought bitter wars over the pieces. One of them, Ptolemy, a trusted companion and capable commander, quickly realized that Egypt offered a rare combination of defensible borders, rich resources, and symbolic power. He moved decisively to secure it. At first, Ptolemy governed Egypt as a satrap, nominally in the name of Alexander's heirs, but as the wars among the Diadochi dragged on, pretenses fell away. By the early 3rd century BC, Ptolemy took the royal title of king and founded the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years. Ptolemy I and his successors reshaped Egypt into a Hellenistic kingdom, a monarchy that blended Greek political forms with local traditions. In the countryside, life for many Egyptian farmers, fellahin, continued along ancient patterns, tied to the Nile's floods and 2 temple estates. But in the cities, especially Alexandria, the atmosphere was strikingly new. Alexandria became the kingdom's capital and showpiece. Its broad streets, Greek-style theaters, gymnasia, and palaces reflected the tastes of its Macedonian and Greek elites. Greek was the language of court, administration, and high culture. The king's closest advisors, officers, and many of the wealthy landholders were of Greek or Macedonian origin, rewarded for their service with estates carved from royal land. Yet Ptolemy understood that to truly rule Egypt, he had to respect and harness its religious traditions. He presented himself in hieroglyphic inscriptions as a pharaoh, making offerings to Egyptian gods, building and restoring temples. At the same time, he and his advisors encouraged forms of religious fusion that could appeal to both Greek and Egyptian subjects. The most famous example was the creation of Serapis, a composite deity with features drawn from the Egyptian gods Osiris and Apis, but depicted in Greek style as a bearded, Zeus-like figure. Serapis cult, centered at the Serapeum in Alexandria, provided a shared religious focus where Greek settlers and Egyptian worshippers could find common ground. Alongside Serapis, other forms of syncretism flourished. Greek gods identified with Egyptian ones, Zeus with Amun for instance, and myths overlapped and intertwined. Economically, the Ptolemaic kingdom became a powerhouse. The state took an active role in managing agriculture, trade, and industry. Royal officials regulated the planting of crops, collected taxes in grain and coin, and oversaw monopolies on products like papyrus, oil, and certain textiles. Alexandria's harbor teemed with ships from across the Mediterranean and Red Sea, carrying goods from as far as India and Nubia. The Ptolemies' control of grain exports gave them leverage in regional politics. Culturally, the Ptolemaic court turned Alexandria into one of the intellectual capitals of the ancient world. Ptolemy I and his son Ptolemy II sponsored the creation of the library and the Museum, an institution that was part research center, part university, part royal academy. Scholars in residence studied everything from mathematics and astronomy to poetry and medicine. They collected and edited Greek literary texts, wrote commentaries, and produced new works. The ambition was nothing less than to gather all knowledge. For Egyptian culture, this Hellenistic environment was both a challenge and an opportunity. Greek became the language of prestige, and many educated Egyptians learned it to advance in administration or scholarship. At the same time, Egyptian temples continued to function as centers of learning in their own tradition, preserving hieroglyphic writing and religious texts. Over time, Egypt under the Ptolemies became a layered society. Greek-speaking elites in cities, Egyptian communities in town and countryside, and a growing number of people who navigated both worlds. The Ptolemaic monarchy, with its fusion of Greek royal ideology and Egyptian pharaonic imagery, stood at the center of this complex kingdom. In its early generations, under rulers like Ptolemy I and II, it projected confidence and stability. But by the 1st century BC, internal struggles and external pressures would draw the dynasty into the orbit of a new Mediterranean superpower, Rome. Among the long line of Ptolemaic rulers, none has captured the world's imagination like Cleopatra VII. She was not the first Cleopatra of the dynasty, nor the only powerful queen, but she became the symbol of its final, dramatic chapter. Born around 69 BC, Cleopatra grew up in a court riven by family rivalries and political intrigues. The Ptolemies had long practiced sibling marriage to keep royal bloodlines pure and power concentrated. Succession disputes were common. Co-rulers and regents schemed against each other. Cleopatra's own father, Ptolemy XII, struggled to keep his throne, relying heavily on Roman support and paying dearly for their favor. Cleopatra's education prepared her for this dangerous world. Ancient sources, including hostile Roman ones, agree that she was highly intelligent and well educated. She reportedly spoke several languages, not only Greek, but also Egyptian and perhaps others spoken in the Eastern Mediterranean. This already set her apart from many earlier Ptolemies, who often relied on interpreters when dealing with their Egyptian subjects. Cleopatra could address different communities directly, an advantage in forging alliances and projecting authority. When Cleopatra came to power, at first as co-ruler with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, Egypt's independence was more fragile than ever. Rome, now the dominant power in the Mediterranean, had turned the eastern kingdoms into clients and provinces. The Ptolemies held their throne largely at Rome's indulgence. Internal conflict soon broke out between Cleopatra and her brother's faction, plunging Egypt into civil war. Into this turmoil stepped Julius Caesar. In 48 BC, Caesar arrived in Alexandria pursuing his rival Pompey, only to find that Pompey had already been murdered on the orders of Ptolemy XIII's advisors. Caesar intervened in the Egyptian succession, and Cleopatra seized the opportunity. In one of the most famous anecdotes of ancient history, she is said to have had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters rolled in a carpet. Whether or not the detail is true, she clearly impressed him. Their alliance was both political and personal. With Caesar's support, Cleopatra defeated her brother's forces. Ptolemy XIII died in the fighting. Cleopatra became queen, now formally co-ruling with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, but in practice holding the real power. She bore Caesar a son, Ptolemy XV, known as Caesarion, Little Caesar. For Cleopatra, alliance with Caesar was a way to secure her throne and Egypt's autonomy under Roman protection. For Caesar, Egypt's wealth could help fund his ambitions, and Cleopatra's support bolstered his prestige in the East. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, Cleopatra's position became precarious again. She returned to Egypt, had her brother and co-ruler eliminated, and elevated Caesarion as her co-king, presenting him as the rightful heir both to the Ptolemies and to Caesar himself. The next crucial Roman figure in Cleopatra's story was Mark Antony, one of Caesar's former lieutenants and for a time one of the three men sharing power in Rome after Caesar's death. Cleopatra and Antony met in 41 BC. Ancient accounts, especially Plutarch's, describe a carefully staged encounter in which Cleopatra arrived by river in magnificent style, presenting herself as Aphrodite or Isis incarnate. The relationship that followed was, again, both political and romantic. Antony needed Egypt's wealth and support in his struggles against his rival, Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. Cleopatra needed a powerful Roman ally to protect her kingdom and advance the claims of her son. Together, they conceived a vision of power centered in the East. Antony granted territories to Cleopatra and her children, presenting them in a grand ceremony in Alexandria as rulers of a new, expansive dynasty. To Octavian and his supporters in Rome, this was alarming. It looked as if Antony were shifting the center of gravity away from Rome, entrusting large parts of Rome's sphere of influence to a foreign queen. The struggle between Octavian and Antony was as much about propaganda as it was about armies. Octavian's camp painted Cleopatra as a dangerous seductress, an exotic Eastern queen bewitching a Roman general and threatening Roman virtue. In their narrative, Antony became a tragic figure ensnared by love and luxury, ready to betray his homeland for Cleopatra's sake. Cleopatra, in this Roman telling, was a temptress, a schemer, a destroyer of men. The reality was more complex. Cleopatra was a seasoned ruler defending her dynasty and kingdom in an era when Rome's expansion left little room for independent states. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony were certainly personal, but they were also calculated political alliances, much like royal marriages and pacts across the ancient world. In Egyptian and Alexandrian eyes, she was not a mere seductress, but a cultivated, multilingual monarch who sponsored temples, supported scholarship, and embodied both Greek and Egyptian traditions. The final act came with the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC, where Octavian's forces defeated those of Antony and Cleopatra. The next year, with Octavian's armies closing in on Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra each chose suicide over capture. The image of Cleopatra's death by asp bite, though famous, may be more literary than historical. Ancient sources offer several versions. What matters is that with her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Octavian had Caesarion killed, removing a potential rival with a plausible claim to be Caesar's son. Egypt was annexed as a province, not given to a client king. Octavian, now Augustus, kept Egypt under his direct control, recognizing its strategic and economic importance. In Roman literature and later European imagination, Cleopatra became a symbol, the fatal queen, the lover of great men, the embodiment of Eastern luxury and danger. But behind the myths stands a capable ruler who spoke to her people in their own tongue, who tried to carve out a space for her ancient kingdom within a Roman world, and who became, in the end, the last pharaoh of a 3,000-year tradition. With Cleopatra's fall, political power in Egypt passed definitively to foreigners. Yet Egyptian culture, language, in new scripts like Demotic and Coptic, and religious traditions persisted, adapting yet again to life under a new empire. The story of Greek Egypt, from Alexander to Cleopatra, thus marks both an ending and a transformation, the close of pharaonic sovereignty, and the beginning of Egypt's long history as a province in larger Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds. When Octavian entered Alexandria in 30 BC, he did more than topple a dynasty. He rewired Egypt's place in the world. What had been the throne of pharaohs and Ptolemies became, almost overnight, the private property of a Roman emperor. Unlike other conquered regions that could be entrusted to senators or client kings, Egypt was treated as too valuable and too dangerous to share. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, made Egypt his personal domain. It was governed by a prefect of equestrian rank, below the senatorial elite, who answered directly to him. Roman senators were forbidden to enter Egypt without imperial permission. This was not a symbolic rule, it was a blunt security measure. Any senator with ambitions and access to Egypt's wealth and grain could become a rival. Augustus meant to ensure that nobody else could use Egypt as a springboard to power, the way he had just seen Cleopatra and Antony attempt. Grain was at the heart of this calculation. The Nile Valley had always been fertile, but under Roman rule, its abundance was harnessed on a new scale. Egypt became the empire's breadbasket. Taxes in kind, especially grain, were collected, stored, and shipped north in great fleets from Alexandria. These convoys, protected by the Roman navy, sailed across the Mediterranean to feed the swelling population of Rome and later other major cities. In times of shortage or political tension, control of Egyptian grain could mean the difference between calm and riots in the capital's streets. The administrative machinery that managed this flow was powerful and intrusive. It built on Ptolemaic practices, land surveys, tax registers, monopolies, but now served distant masters. Greek remained the working language of bureaucracy, with Latin used in military and high imperial contexts. Local elites could gain status as officials, landowners, or city councillors, but the ultimate authority resided with the emperor and his prefect, not with any native crown. For traditional temple culture, the Roman centuries were a long twilight. At first, much looked familiar. Emperors appeared on temple walls in pharaonic poses, smiting enemies and offering to the gods. Sanctuaries in places like Dendera, Edfu, and Philae still rang with hymns to Isis, Horus, and Hathor. Priests maintained rituals that in some cases had roots in the Old Kingdom. The old religious framework did not vanish with Cleopatra. But the balance had shifted. Temples no longer stood beside a native royal court that saw them as an essential pillar of rule. Instead, they depended on the goodwill of distant emperors and the economic strength of local communities. Gradually, their landholdings shrank. Their political influence waned, and competition grew from new religious movements. Greek language and culture spread further among urban elites. Roman citizenship, granted to some inhabitants over time, brought its own incentives. In the countryside, Egyptian language, now written mostly in Demotic script, remained strong, but the prestige of hieroglyphs, the sacred script carved on stone, faded as fewer scribes mastered it and fewer monuments were commissioned. Christianity accelerated this transformation. From the 3rd and 4th centuries CE onward, as Christian communities proliferated and emperors embraced the new faith, support for the old gods declined sharply. Temples were closed, repurposed, or left to decay. The priests who had once been guardians of vast libraries and ritual knowledge found themselves increasingly marginal. One small inscription marks a colossal turning point. At the island temple of Philae in southern Egypt, in 394 CE, a priest carved a set of hieroglyphs, routine, pious words, probably unnoticed by anyone at the time. It is the last known dated hieroglyphic inscription. After more than 3,000 years, the script of the pyramids and obelisks fell silent. The tradition of reading and writing it died within a few generations. Egypt remained a vital province of Rome, still rich, still strategic. But the civilization that had once defined itself through its kings, temples, and sacred signs had been transformed. The Nile flowed on, now beneath the banner of emperors in Pharaoh Rome and increasingly beneath the shadow of new religions and new languages. Political independence ended, temples dimmed, hieroglyphs were forgotten, but Egypt did not truly vanish. Instead, its ideas, images, and even its ruins escaped their original context and seeped into other cultures, where they took on new lives. Ancient Egyptian religion left one of its deepest marks in the realm of the afterlife. For millennia, Egyptians had imagined a judgment after death. The heart of the deceased weighed on a scale against the feather of Mot, the principle of truth and order. If the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, a monstrous devourer waited. If it balanced, the soul passed on to a blessed existence. This scene, depicted endlessly in tombs and on papyri, expressed a powerful idea that what you did in life mattered eternally. Later religions of the region, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, developed their own visions of judgment and accountability beyond death. These were shaped by many influences, but the Egyptian insistence that the universe had moral weight, that there was a reckoning after the grave, formed part of the imaginative background of the ancient Near East. The very notion of sacred texts to guide the soul also finds strong early expression in Egypt's funerary literature. Pyramid texts, coffin texts, and most famously, the so-called Book of the Dead. These were collections of spells, prayers, and instructions meant to help the deceased navigate dangers, name guardians, and present the right words at gates and thresholds. The idea that written words could structure and safeguard a soul's journey would echo down the centuries. In the physical world, Egyptian architecture cast a long shadow. The Greeks and Romans stood before ancient temples and pyramids with a mixture of awe and curiosity. They borrowed obelisks, those tall tapering stone needles, from their original settings, transporting them to adorn city squares. Rome, Constantinople, and later European capitals would bristle with these strange imports, stripped of their original meaning but still radiating authority. The columned halls and monumental facades of Egyptian temples influenced classical builders, who adapted and reinterpreted them. Centuries later, in the modern era, architects looked back not only to Greece and Rome but directly to Egypt. Napoleonic campaigns in North Africa, detailed surveys, and the decipherment of hieroglyphs in the 19th century opened the ancient civilization to European eyes in a new way. Egyptian motifs flooded art and design, lotus capitals, winged sun discs, sphinx, and above all, the pyramid form. Banks, cemeteries, museums, and even city gates were built in an Egyptian revival style. The obelisk became a favorite shape for monuments, from London and Paris to Washington, D.C. The most famous American example, the Washington Monument, is essentially a giant, uninscribed obelisk, a modern echo of Thutmose and Hatshepsut translated into a republic's language of grandeur. This wave of fascination, Egyptomania, was fueled not only by aesthetics but by archaeology. Napoleon's savants catalogued ruins and inscriptions. In 1822, Jean-François Champollion cracked the code of hieroglyphs using the Rosetta Stone, allowing Egypt's own voices to be heard again. In 1922, Howard Carter's discovery of Tutankhamun's nearly intact tomb ignited worldwide excitement. Jewelry, fashion, cinema, and literature all fell under Egypt's spell. But Egyptomania was not just a Western obsession. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as Egypt itself struggled with foreign domination and then fought for independence, the pharaonic past became a resource for nationalism. Intellectuals and politicians invoked ancient kings and monuments as proof of Egypt's deep roots and unique identity. New museums were founded to house and display artifacts as national treasures, not colonial curiosities. Archaeology, once an extractive enterprise shipping statues and sarcophagi abroad, became increasingly tied to Egyptian control and pride. Thus, even as the old temples had long since fallen silent, their stones helped shape modern identities. Ancient Egypt survived not as a living kingdom but as a memory, a repertoire of symbols and stories. Its gods and scripts no longer governed daily life, yet the civilization continued to exert a gravitational pull on imaginations, from Roman emperors erecting obelisks to modern filmmakers conjuring curses and mummies. What endured above all was an image, a land of monumental stone rising out of desert and river, of careful order set against chaos, of human beings trying to secure a place in an uncertain eternity. That image, once crafted by Egyptians for themselves, became part of a shared global heritage. We began this journey with a people learning to live with a river. Small villages on the Nile's banks watched its floods, read its moods, and slowly turned seasonal rhythms into something more permanent. Fields, granaries, shrines. From those first experiments in settled life emerged the possibility of a kingdom. We followed Egypt as it found its voice in stone. Pyramids rising at Giza, hieroglyphs marching across tomb walls, kings claiming to hold the two lands together under the gaze of the gods. We stood at Kadesh, where Ramesses II charged his chariots into battle and then carved his own version of the story into every temple he could, shaping memory as much as history. We walked through the corridors of Thebes, under painted ceilings and among columns like forests of stone. We watched the center shift, to the sharp-edged pyramids of the Old Kingdom, to the sprawling royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings, to the crumbling palaces of late native dynasties fighting off Assyrians and Persians. We saw a Macedonian conqueror stride into Memphis and be crowned as pharaoh, then sketch the lines of a new city, Alexandria, into the sand. We traced the lives of Greek-speaking kings who wrapped themselves in Egyptian imagery while ruling from marble palaces. We stood finally beside Cleopatra VII, the last in a long line of rulers who tried to hold Egypt's independence against larger powers. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, her intelligence and statecraft, her dramatic end. These were not just the end of a dynasty, but the closing chapter of an idea, that Egypt could stand as its own sovereign world, with its own kings mediating between gods and people. Across these thousands of years, one question runs like the Nile itself. How did Egypt endure so long? Part of the answer lies in its willingness to adapt. Egypt repeatedly accepted new rulers, Hyksos chieftains, Nubian kings, Assyrian conquerors, Persian emperors, Macedonian generals, Roman Caesars, and folded them, to varying degrees, into its own framework. Foreigners became pharaohs. Their names were written in cartouches, their images carved offering to Ra and Osiris. The ideology of kingship, the rhythm of temple rituals, the calendar of festivals, these could stretch to include outsiders, so long as they respected the forms. Egypt's core was not a single dynasty but a way of imagining order. Mott against chaos, the king as guarantor of balance, the promise that life, if properly lived and ritually secured, could continue beyond death. That worldview proved extraordinarily resilient. It absorbed shocks, bent around invaders, and emerged, again and again, still recognizably Egyptian. Under Rome, however, that core began to thin. The emperor was too distant to be truly pharaonic. The real decisions were made in imperial councils far from the Nile. New religions offered different paths to salvation. New scripts and languages carried prestige. The old partnership between crown and temple, which had sustained Egypt's religious and political system, weakened until it finally broke. When the last hieroglyph was carved at Philae, it marked not just the end of a writing system, but the silence of a whole way of seeing the world. And yet, even as a living civilization, Egypt died only in stages. Its people did not vanish. They became Roman subjects, then Byzantine, then Arab. They became Christians, then mostly Muslims. They spoke Demotic, then Coptic, then Arabic. Through all these changes, they continued to farm the same black soil, to watch the same river rise and fall, to live in the shadow of the same ancient stones. If you stand today on the riverbank at Luxor or Aswan at sunset, you can see layers of time at once. Feluccas glide across the water. Palm trees sway in the evening wind. In the distance, columns loomed 3,000 years ago still catch the last light. Their capitals painted once in bright blues and reds, now worn to the color of sand. Children play by the shore. Calls to prayer float over ruins that once echoed with hymns to Amun or Isis. Civilizations, like people, are mortal. They rise, flourish, and fade. Their languages fall silent, their gods lose worshippers, their political borders dissolve. But something of them remains in the stones they leave behind, in the ideas they pass on, in the stories others tell about them. Egypt's political era as a pharaonic kingdom ended long ago. Its temples are ruins, its kings dust, its sacred script once more deciphered only by specialists. Yet the Nile still flows past their resting places, indifferent and eternal. It is the same river that Neolithic farmers first tamed, that carried stones for Khufu's pyramid, that reflected the sails of Hatshepsut's ships, that bore grain for Rome's hungry crowds. Civilizations die. The river remains, and in watching that river, and in reading the marks left on its banks, we catch a glimpse of our own impermanence, and of the possibility that, like Egypt, something of us may endure in memory long after our empires have passed away.